interest of time, please take your seat. So we're ready to start with the presentation by my colleague Kurt Kreuzer, who doesn't need introduction. Kurt, before becoming a computer scientist, actually studied Tibetan at Bloomington in Indiana. So he is one of our group, he's part of the group in Buddhist studies. His principal appointment is, of course, in the School of Engineering, but he regularly reads with Jake and other colleagues Tibetan material. So his talk is going to kind of delve into what AI can do for Buddhist studies. Thank you, Kurt.
Thanks, Alex.
The floor is yours.
So today I'll be investigating, does Buddhist studies need an AI assistant? And broadly, I'm going to have three parts to my talk today. The state of the art in AI, what is academic Buddhist studies, and how can AI assist Buddhist studies? And yesterday, I've adapted my talk a bit to talks yesterday. This whole issue came up, what is AI versus machine learning, deep learning, large language models, agents, and so forth. And I can actually go on and on about this, but I wouldn't have time to talk about much else. So if you're interested, just in case you are, I have a whole talk about this as part of a keynote at the Design Automation Conference in 2021. That's actually on YouTube. And then you just search on it there. And then much more recently, earlier this year, I gave a talk at the MLSys conference. And the videos are not up there, but my slides are. So you can take a look there. And I go on and on about it. Okay, so but I'm just going to jump now to what's the state of the art. And on the left here we see a whole series of different applications from computer vision, audio, multimedia, and natural language processing. And on the far right what you see is this little kind of, you might think of it as an algorithmic element, a particular style of neural net. And the amazing thing is that I've worked on all 12 of these over the last 17 years. I've been involved in machine learning, then deep learning, now large language models. The best solution to any of the problems on the left all basically come from one paradigm, one algorithmic unit, which is the transformer. So I'll probably say 2 or 3 times because I'm just astonished myself, having worked my whole over 40-year career, and I'm, I guess, over 45 now. We have never seen anything like this. We've never found an algorithmic paradigm that held on for any period of time, much less kind of consolidated around a single algorithmic element. So this is truly, truly astonishing. And this is kind of culminated in this large language model, GPT 4.0. Of course, they're constantly evolving, and there's 4.0i and so forth. And that was presented to the public through ChatGPT. And based on, I guess, the successes of the prior use of transformers and so forth, they did something that seemed kind of naive at the time, which is they just kept dramatically increasing the number of transformers that you used, right? So this apparently naive approach, which from what I gather from conversations there was seen as kind of, expensive experiment, turned out to be unexpectedly successful, far beyond anyone's expectations. So the nature of that experiment was, I mentioned that a lot of these things, like you take speech recognition, we can pretty much do that with one transformer. They put 120 transformers together. Often, a lot of problems we can solve with 1, maybe 3 billion parameters. Sorry, my computer science colleagues, let's think of that as like a brain cell. They put together 1.8 trillion. They used $60 million of compute, and that took something like 2.5 million GPU days to do. So what we have there is the model was huge, the amount of computation they threw at is huge, and of course that digested an appropriately huge amount of data with this 13 trillion tokens. Think of that as about 10 trillion words taken from Common Crawl, Refined Web, Twitter, Reddit, your YouTube videos, and so forth, right? So it was an amazing experiment. Now, and that was fantastically successful. And one thing I'm going to convey is this training process, which again, I don't have time to go through what exactly happens. But you can kind of think that we put this big model and a bunch of data together, and we kind of bake them together, and it bakes into a single model all the knowledge that we picked up from the web, as well as kind of capabilities to reason a bit about that. And what I want to convey here is, with this notion of baking in, is that once we bake it in, it's like a cake. That's what it is. That's what you get. So, reiterate, tens of thousands of algorithms have been proposed over the years. Many of us spent our entire careers working algorithm for this, algorithm for that, and so forth. The current best solution, chances are, for the problems that we're working on are based on these transformers. And if I were to try my very best to distill, so what's unique about these transformers and these large language models? It's a very unique property that the more data we give it and the more computation we apply, the more performance improves over a broad range of applications. So if that doesn't sound unique to you, wouldn't that be great if that was true of humans, right? I mean, just imagine you kind of get a massage, good night's sleep, maybe a little head massage, shoulders, have a nice meal, and suddenly your IQ goes up 20 points, right? That's an analogy. But, that unfortunately that's not true, but it is somehow true with these transformer-based models. Now, the problem with those models, aside from them just being kind of like black box, we honestly don't understand them very well, and it's not just I'm not quite up to date. Nobody who understands them well, and anybody who doesn't feels they understand well is really on a fringy kind of like the field's kind of taking it under consideration. Maybe something like that is true. There's no consensus about how these work. But that black box also, the minute you're done training, what it knows is what it knows. It's not learning anything else. Now that's obviously unfortunate because we want to extend that capability. And so the way we extend that capability is what's called fine-tuning, which is we just essentially use the same paradigm of training, but we just add more data. And we can enhance the data of that model if we have the expertise. Fine-tuning can degrade the functional large language model, and Sebastian has become something of an expert on the process of fine-tuning. Of course, we need additional data sources, and we need quite significant computational resources to do this. So we've done this a few times. Sebastian went through this. I'll just go through it as much as an acknowledgement to our many data partners as anything else. So we did this on Tibetan with the help principally of Monlam AI, Geshe Monlam, and T here, who's here with us today, Jan from BDRC, 84,000 folks, Zadra, Wisdom Publications, great to see you both here, Lotsawa House, and so forth. With cooperation among all those, certain amount of endorsement, I would say, we pulled together 2 million sentence pairs, which kind of brought Tibetan from a low resource language to kind of a mid resource language. French, say, has over 60 million sentence pairs. We had our own kind of grassroots effort here, kind of led by David Alpert, the Gandalf-looking fellow in the front here, and his volunteer army of basically principally Indian national students who wanted to get into natural language processing in some way. Oftentimes very junior students, oftentimes I have to say, we really don't have anything reasonable to you. Now I go, do we have something for you? So we get them gathering and cleaning up data. We also got a lot of help from Oliver Helwig, as Sebastian mentioned, Sarvam AI and AI for Bharat, which are both principally interested in the 22 scheduled languages of India, of which Sanskrit comes kind of dead last, but they are interested in Sanskrit as well. And Professor Mitesh Katra at IIT has been particularly helpful. And with that effort, we didn't get 2 million, but we got 1 million sentence pairs. And I think with those two together, we more or less created the state-of-the-art machine translation models for Sanskrit as well as Tibetan. And then finally, I think a little more on the drawing board, but with help from Fogwan Shan and Professor Bingenheimer there, Marcus Bingenheimer, we've gathered together data for Chinese, and I guess we can debate. Sebastian was confidently said we have state-of-the-art. I'll take his word on that. Yeah. Okay, so that's fine-tuning, but fine-tuning suffers from all the same problems of ordinary training. that the minute we're done fine-tuning, that's what the model does. Again, it's kind of think we just add some more ingredients to a cake and kind of rebake it, but now once we've done with that, that's baked. So it's impractical to keep up with the advancement of state of the art in anything, additional information and so forth, through this process of training and fine-tuning. It's just too expensive and cumbersome. So, but we want to augment, again, I'm going to call it parametric knowledge, the thing that's baked in with data sources. And so the way we do this is a technique called RAG, or Retrieval Augmented Generation. So LLMs can be trained to actually not just recognize language, but understand language in such a way to gather then data from other sources, what I show here on the far right. We then augment that is used to augment the parametric knowledge, and then with that additional knowledge as well as the baked-in parametric knowledge, we can give better results to queries. I'm a big fan of Perplexity AI. I guess I should mention that first of all, that the founder, Arvind Srinivas, came from our Berkeley AI Research Laboratory, where I work as a professor. And I'm also a very modest investor, I should disclose. But I was able to wrangle for you all a 1 year free of Perplexity Pro. So yeah, get your cameras out, snap a picture of that, and try it. And you can share it with your friends as well. They're being reasonably evangelical at this time, but maybe now's as good a time as any to mention. I don't think that any of these major ChatGPT, these chatbots and so forth, are probably profitably accounting for the amount of computation that they're throwing. They're all competing to gather users, and so we're in this magical period in which we're getting, even if you're paying $20 a month, you're getting more than your fair share of computation, you can be sure. If you do choose to use this, I would recommend using the Claude 3 model among your choices, Claude 3 Opus. So what we see here in a retrieval augmented generation system is, on the far left is the prompt, just as like you'd use on any chatbot, that goes through the core model, but then it goes out and looks around the World Wide Web for the latest information, anything that might be relevant, augments that, summarizes that, and generates an answer to your prompt in that way. So this is a paradigm that we're trying to apply to Buddhist studies, and this Sebastian showed a bit of this yesterday. So we kind of think of this Mitra search as kind of a Perplexity AI for Dharma studies, in which we have the same notion of a core model in the middle, but then we have a wide variety of data resources, both primary sources in a variety of languages, as well as personal libraries with the secondary literature, which we could then draw on to actually answer your query. So this is, it's a cartoon-esque slide. Sebastian gave what were more anatomically correct slides yesterday. It's a much more ambitious enterprise than may be represented by this cartoon, but I do think it can really help us advance Buddhist studies. But wait, one more tool that I'll mention in terms of us building an AI assistant for Buddhist studies is Google's Notebook LM. I have no affiliate, well, I do get a bit of funding from Google, but I haven't even been able to get the attention of the Google Notebook LM, even through my Google contacts. They're not bothering to return emails or anything. So I think that's partially due to the tremendous success of this. People, even Andrei Karpathy, if you know him, is raving about it. He's a very key influencer and truly brilliant individual. So what Google's Notebook LM gives you is it can read PDFs, so you can just pour in your PDFs. It'll do optical character recognition, at least for modern languages there. It'll do machine translation for popular languages, 38 languages, perhaps more. When I've given it PDFs of the Tibetan, it says, sorry, I don't translate Tibetan. It'll do summarization. I'll show you some other abilities. And it has the same capabilities of retrieval augmented generation that I showed you in the prior slide, but in the small. You can put in like 50 documents, not huge libraries. So I'm just flashing you the interface on the far left. You have your sources that you've drawn in. You can automatically generate notes, or you can simply add them. It will In the lower right, you see a menu for creating a study guide or a table of contents or a briefing doc. You can generate a podcast if you want automatically. That's been one of its most popular features. And then finally, you get the traditional chatbot prompt, which you can then use to query over the documents that you've read in. Okay, so taking that from the top in terms of, I'm in the old-time genre of telling you what I'm going to tell you what I told you. So how to build an AI assistant for Buddhist studies. Talked about how we're going to help you with searching, reading primary literature with machine translation, reading and managing secondary literature with something like NotebookLM. Later I'm going to talk about agents, which are really the one hot topic in AI that I haven't mentioned. And then I should give you the caveats though. I mean, some of you have used these and have some expectations, some of you have not. All these tools are under 2 years of age, so they have their challenges. And I think the most annoying thing for me is that they all have capacity challenges, and they don't exactly tell you. So you'll ask for a summarization of a document and you'll go back and go, you quit halfway. Or you'll ask for a translation of something and go, well, this is just the first 5 pages, but they don't really clue you in on that. Okay, so next, let's investigate a little bit of what is this area of academic Buddhist studies. As Alex mentioned, I started hanging out with Tibetan scholar types back in Indiana with Dan Martin and Christopher Beckwith and Elliot Sperling and so forth. It was Tsukuhisa Takeuchi, Yael Bentor. It was kind of a magical era when I was there. So I had my own impression of what was Buddhist studies, but I'm going to talk in front of a bunch of Buddhologists, so I thought I better do my homework. So, again, in trying to see how are these tools really helping us, well, actually these chatbot tools and so forth, Perplexity, none of these particularly help doing something like Buddhist studies because I'm looking for essentially secondary literature that gives these broad surveys. And in addition, some of them will hallucinate and so forth. And our own Mitra search doesn't yet cover any secondary literature, so none of that really helped. So I was back to good old, conventional approaches to how to build a bibliography. And basically what I'm showing you here is the kind of visual of the bibliography that I built, basically going over the duration that the particular article covered or the lecture, and then color-coded to the region, either Europe and America, or Japan, or India, and so forth, and then the timeline of when that was covering at the bottom here. Okay, so I was happy. I had dreamed of finding kind of the single, published in 2022, grand endorsed. This is the field of Buddhist studies. Everybody's fist bump. This is it. No, nothing like that. So instead I came up with these 12 diverse articles, which rarely cite each other, incidentally, which is always surprising to someone from outside the field, since we have to cite to death, otherwise we get our papers rejected in computer science. So, but anyway, altogether I had 370 pages, and I didn't really have time to go through all that. So what I did was I assembled my sources in PDF form and created a notebook in NotebookLM, as I mentioned before. So there they are around the left. You can simply drag and drop. This is not one of those things that sounds that easy, but actually it is that easy. And then I prompted it, say, for each of the 12 selected sources, identify the most common topics and list them in decreasing order of frequency, and then give references for each. And I've given a distillation of the topics there at the bottom, and that's not all it returned. I'll show you the raw data. I won't go in depth through it because you'll get the idea in just a moment. But again, this is from NotebookLM's perspective, or the Gemini model underneath. From what it saw, this is what it thinks. So it thinks Buddhist text and translation are the most common topic, then Buddhist history and development, Buddhist philosophy and doctrines. Again, every piece of text here is from NotebookLM. I didn't edit this at all. Buddhist community and life practices, I was a little surprised at how high that bumped up over interdisciplinary approaches, and especially above specific regional traditions. Again, this was a little humbling for me, since living, more or less studying only Tibetan Buddhism, principally I was kind of like, this is kind of, page 3 of the list here, one bullet item, but that's it. and then a potpourri of other topics. And again, if you're disappointed that your life's work is not represented here, then don't blame me, don't blame NotebookLM, okay? All right, so what does this approach miss? So I thought this was an important question to address. And these summaries are objective to a fault. We're missing this kind of unique human and collegial character of Buddhist studies that I've known ever since I was at Indiana. Like one article begins or has in paragraph 2, while the Germans presented a vast bibliography, the American presentation did not attempt to include anything like a comprehensive bibliography, but instead ran way over time and characterized each individual work discussed as stunning. Yes, that's the field of Buddhist studies, I remember so well. Now, there was a little payback there. A later reviewer says, instead of a conclusion referring to the same article that I just cited, G returns to his own work and readers are again informed about the seminal significance of his contributions to the field. Okay, so just so you're clear, this is what you're missing when you use something like a bot to do the summary of your literature. And I'm joking about that, but Google and others put a lot of effort into, I think, making sure that what they produce doesn't offend, right? So if you're looking for controversy and snarky comments and so forth like that, you know, don't use a chatbot. Okay. So on a summary of this AI-assisted reading approach to secondary literature, using these language models and chatbot to read secondary, it's especially convenient, and you get a modest amount of translation for free. I didn't get to showcase that in this example. And my own personal perspective is that since I needed to download the articles anyway, I conservatively estimated it'd take me 10 to 15 hours, probably more like 20 to 30, you know, highlighting, taking notes as I go. Using NotebookLMs, after loading the PDFs, I got a summary of the 12 or 13 papers and transcripts in about 30 seconds, although the large language model was probably warmed up by queries. So as I mentioned, there was this kind of humbling exit, realizing how small the field that I thought Buddhist study was. But on the positive side, I felt energized and optimistic rather than exhausted by all this detail. I never resented what I was doing, right? I was like, okay, this is fun. As educators, like it or not, I think this approach to reading, educators and publishers, looking at anyone there, this approach to reading is going to change how our students and readers of our works approach reading. Now, for those of you who are nauseated by that notion, I do have vomit bags here, which, Alex, just raise your hand.
I don't have enough.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And please don't be shy. I can easily understand. Okay. So Bob's my conscience, and what's left for humans to do? Like a lot, right? So with all that time that I saved by not going line by line through those papers, I took a huge step back. And this was kind of my summary. On the far left, we have the objects of study, then moving to the right, the place of origin and the languages used, the focal point and perspective of the studies, the residence of where the scholar, so you know, whoever was doing that scholarship, what university were they in, where was that located, these additional lenses of study, and the work products. And again, this was kind of partially, for the purpose of the conference, partially demonstrational of the tools, but happy to discuss these at the break and so forth. Okay, so now moving on to the prime topic, how can AI assist Buddhist studies? So, at some point I realized this is a familiar position to me. I'm not here to sell you an AI assistant, but I have spent my entire professional career, what pays the bills in building tools for people. And so I first did kind of a sense of the customer. And one key thing I learned from venture capitalists was, it's one thing to get an overview of what your customer does. It's another to really look, what do they really do in a day in their life? Because you really can't build a tool for them unless you really see how they spend their time. So this is a little model that I put. And first and foremost, or beginning inquire, and I do say foremost because I think in looking at our relationship with AI, inquiring may be the single most important thing that we do. You might think reflect, but I actually, nothing happens until we put something in the prompt. So the direction that we take may be the single most creative part of this process. And so what do we inquire about? We may inquire about big questions like when did the historical Buddha live? Kind of like Dan Martin, we may have a lifelong inquiry about a comprehensive view of Tibetan history. Or I think a lot of what I see is what might be individual passing fascinations. I came across a biography of Muchen Simpachenpo in which he mentioned that he had which is mentioned he had a guru as a Tertin. That sounds like something interesting to follow up. So, but a more kind of typical inquiry, and one that I thought I'd use for this, is a question of how did the four seals of Dharma evolve and become codified? So, some time ago, I read in a footnote of his translation of Nagarjuna's Prajnaparamita, Mahaprajnaparamita Shastra, Etienne Lamotte gives several variants of Dharma Mudra. The seals of Dharma is found in Pali Sutra as well as Sanskrit sutras. And, this is one of those, what I learned back in Indiana. Some people write footnotes that are stronger than other people's long scholarly studies, right? So this is one of those amazing footnotes. But what struck me immediately like this, and I won't embarrass myself by taking you through the Pali and Sanskrit, I think this is a Buddhist studies crowd, so I think you're all familiar with these, is that the formulation that I was most familiar with, which I show in Tibetan here and in the translation, in particular, all contaminant things are suffering, wasn't there at all. So that was kind of disturbing. And look at, any of the kind of contemporary writings that I've found that address this notion of the four seals, all of them agree with what I show you on this slide, and none of them agree with the presentation in the prior slide. So just to make that clear, I have the Sanskrit that Lamotte pointed to on the far left, I have the Tibetan equivalent in the middle, and then I have the more common formulation on the right. Now, I had originally planned, I really nerded out on this, and I had really planned to really kind of take you through it, and then suddenly it hit me, these people are not here to listen to me talk about the four seals. So I'm just going to kind of highlight the way in which I use these tools to come to this. So next search, and you'll understand why I say filter and read. So I tried good old Perplexity with some high-level prompts, and I won't take you through all the details, but the main thing that they did, that those prompts did, is point me to Stanley's dissertation, David Stanley's dissertation from 2009, which is a very broad dissertation, and it's only 5 pages in which he talks about the four seals, and particularly with regard to Tibet. But the key thing is he does talk about them explicitly, and he makes a couple points. He says, Longchenpa is the first Tibetan who mentions the four sutra seals, which I found interesting. And again, he's not talking about any particular formulation. He's saying mention them as four seals explicitly. And then he says there's additional evidence that Tibetans did not know of an Indian source for the four seals. So honestly, at this point, I'm kind of more confused than ever, right? So good old Indian train back to the primary sources. So I first did we came from yesterday to understand a syntactic or a keyword search, primary sources of BDRC. And it gave, doing an e-text search, and it gave a lot of references, but nothing from the Kangyur and Tangyur, right? Lots of Tibetan authors. Since Stanley brought up this, when did this first enter Tibet? I was curious to see, is he right, it was a Longchenpa or was there someone earlier? And sure enough, just going through the BDRC references, on the far left here you see a nice feature that they've added over the years in which you can sort the results of their e-texts through centuries. And so, just going sequentially through centuries, I found this nice quote by Gampopa. And then just kind of progressing through the centuries, I was then able to find things by Lama Shang, Jigten Sumgun, further in the Kagyu, and then in the 13th century spread into the Sakya, and then 14th century finally get to Stanley's observation of Longchen Drimi Ozer, and then by the time we see Tsongkhapa and Kedrupje quoting in precisely this manner, then we know basically the four schools have been covered. But still we don't have a Kangyur or Tangyur reference to this, anything like this Sakje Tamche Dungno. So, sounds like a job for an AI assistant to me. So using Sebastian Smitra search for semantic search, which is now currently limited to just the canonical literature, I was able to get 27 results, including 2 Kangyur references the Sandhi-Nirmochana Sutra, and let's just call it Tohoku 155, if that's all right with you. And again, just to contrast those, so why wasn't BDRC able to help me? They tune up and take grammatical particles out and so forth, but basically it's still a syntactic search, whereas, as Sebastian pointed out, there's this difference in doing this semantic search, which is also multilingual. Okay, so I mentioned, in this new era of search, in which we get 27, 100, other searches on MetraSearch gave 100, which is their max out. There's no way to go through that manually. So they've got this very nice thing you see down at the bottom, this explanation button. So first of all, you get the text. So I can copy and paste this into Dharma Mitra and translate it if I can't read it quickly myself. Or I can just hit this explanation button, and what you see here is the explanation below of that passage. It's not a translation, so we should probably work on, would you like a translation or would you like an explanation? But it's still, it makes it much faster to go through those references than dutifully trying to sort out one by one. I'm just going to put you to Tohoku 155. And again, I'm highlighting this one passage. So now we have found this passage in a nice, naturally contextual place going back to Kangyur. So that's progress. MetraSearch also showed lots of meaningful parallels in Tangyur, particularly from the Abhidharma literature, and I'll see why that is relevant in just a moment. So, revisiting my inquiry, Sanskrit on the far left, Tibetan equivalent of the Sanskrit in the middle, and common Tibetan formulation on the far right, it's natural to kind of look more carefully into the Samskara versus Sasraba, or Duje versus Sakche. And so I do that doing standard library search. And this is a frustration I felt over my entire little amateur career, is you get these great articles in Japanese, but sounds like a job for an AI assistant to me. I just prompt now, I've already read that article in, give a complete translation selected source from Japanese to English. These prompts are important. Translate every word and sentence, otherwise it's going to just skip around and try and tell me that it did a good job. Please path through Japanese and Chinese technical terminology and translation, and this is what you get. And I won't, again, you're not here to hear me lecture about this, but I just want to demonstrate this capability. So, time for reflection. So this early MetraSearches, the Abhidharma literature really predominated. And so I've got this great book, Sanskrit book on Abhidharma that has all these diagrams in Sanskrit. I've transliterated them here. And what you see, so what do we get by using Sakche or Sasrava rather than Samskara or Duje? Well, if you look at this diagram, we get exactly one thing, which is Marga is excluded as an element of suffering. And that nicely led to, so I talked to Alex, and he recalled a conversation with David Rug, who insisted on the formulation Sakche, Tamche Dugno, because otherwise, precisely, Marga, the noble path, is a samskara. In the first form, it would be suffering. In the second form, it is not. Nice, huh? Okay, so can an AI assistant help us to reflect? So I went through all this, and basically it was an afterthought. I never really gave NotebookLM a chance. I found a little something, I had some hypotheses. I immediately went to Alex. Alex was very kind. First of all, correcting all my Sanskrit diacritical mistakes, and then kind of sharing this nice story of his own reflections and David Rug. But I never really gave NotebookLM. So I said, prompt, the four seals of Buddhism are considered to epitomize Buddhist view. Over time, one of the seals, and I use I'm sorry, I should give some background. I'm bringing in this Lodo Sangpo's translation of Abhidharma Koshabhasya, and then I went in the prompt to use precisely that terminology so this is why Alex is not very happy with my translation choices, but I'm just trying to use homogeneity so that I get a better chance of getting results across different literature. Over time, one of the seals, all conditioned things are suffering, was reformulated as all impure things are suffering. So given this source for context, give a few speculations on why this reformulation occurs. And it actually gives a number of sensible ideas, I think, and in particular, this is the full result on clarifying the scope of suffering, which I mean, I don't think if I'd gotten this prompt, I would have been able to recreate the conversation with Alex. But I think, it might have led to another inquiry. Maybe I would have gotten there, maybe I wouldn't. But anyway. Okay, so I won't go through, again, try to explain to you the 4 seals and what we learned. We didn't, we did, well, briefly, we found it in the Kangyur. We found it early in Tibet and had this particular observation that this excludes Marga from the path of suffering. Sorry, Marga, the path from inclusion as suffering, but obviously there's so much more to explore. So how did AI assist and what was their downside of that? Perplexity helped with initial references, not much after that. Mitra searches, semantic search was absolutely essential. I did a lot of translation, which I didn't show you. Some was perfectly obvious to me, I didn't need it, but longer, a couple paragraph passages, I just popped them in and got an immediate translation from Mitra or Cloud. And Notebook LM was again useful in organizing and translating secondary literature. So in this little vein, it's really hard for me to see any downside to any of that assistance. All I think is that, a lot of the heavy lifting was done for me. The one thing is, I can easily imagine thinking that getting lulled into, oh yeah, now I don't have to do any work because these are not finding everything for you. So there's, if you want to be very thorough and bulletproof, then there's still work to be done. Okay, what does a Buddhist scholar do? There's also exposition. I'm going to shift gears a bit here because obviously I'm not prepared to talk about an exposition with regard to the 4 seals right now. So I'm going to talk about the different types of exposition that we do in Buddhist studies. This is from the beginning. And you can just read them there. And then I'll just briefly point out how AI can assist. So for reference materials, I think it was brought up yesterday, there's a lot that can be automated or semi-automated. I'm not going to talk about multimedia at all. Image, video, 3D generation, named entity recognition, language editing. So let's take a quick look at how machine translation can help. So I won't go through the history of this, but this is kind of my distillation. I have a whole document there at the bottom going into detail of kind of a synthesis on the translation process. And basically, depending on the type of material, as many of you know much better than I do, any one of these steps can dominate the process. Finding additions and trying to create a critical addition, or the draft translation itself, or just the footnotes. Any one of these can dominate, or Cyrus Stern says he spends most of his time just refining. 2/3 of his time goes to refining his translation. So machine translation obviously helps most when step 3 dominates. How to think about it, I just think of it as like a member of a translation team, a grad student seminar, and I give here a number of other things which 84,000, basically I think we're pretty much in agreement in the scope of what machine translation can do. And you might argue that this all boils down to being productive. And then Dan Martin did this nice blog post. He reflects that basically in so many words, is productivity really what we want? He's concerned that editing, starting with machine translation, will never give the best quality translation. He's concerned that translators will use it as a crutch, and speed is only a virtue if you're getting paid by the hour. So this led me to the question, well, is a translator Buddhism more like an artist, creating this kind of masterful piece of artistry, or are they more like an apothecary, which strives to create a medicine accurately according to a prescription? So I'm not going to resolve that at this very moment, but I think it's an interesting dialogue. And Dan and I go back to Indiana over like 45 years ago, so it was a very pleasant engagement. And you'll see my comments on his blog spot. I actually put them to him personally, but he put them there. Okay, finally, educate. What we do is educate. So I just want to taunt you that online education is completely revolutionizing my field. We're getting high school students who, through Coursera classes, are pretty well educated when they show up as freshmen and publishing first author papers, doing research, original research as sophomores. So challenge you, can we do this for Buddhist studies, particularly for language learning? And to me, the key elements, which is why I didn't have this when I learned Sanskrit, is gaining the ability to read what you want and interactive directed feedback on your progress. So these are demonstrated from Sebastian yesterday. I think that Mitra can make, particularly for Sanskrit, language learning more interactive and fun. You get your grammatical explanations for free. There's these natural questions. Will these tools help or hinder language learning? And so choosing your own literature and progressing at your own pace is fun and inspiring, I think. But of course, are you going to learn all those Sandhi rules, noun declensions, and verb conjugations if a tool does all that for you? And so I think the answer to this is this last piece of AI technology, which is called an agent or copilot, which the next step that this does is that it's actually able to do planning. It's not just prompt and result. It's able to plan and invoke other tools and so forth. Like something as simple as making a dinner reservation actually has many planning steps that have to be required to perform that. There's a huge investment in this. These are just startups and agents that have occurred in the last 2 years. I mean, tens of billions of dollars are going into this. And so I think the last vision I have, I don't have anything to demonstrate on any of this, is really something more like a Buddhist studies private tutor in which I could go and say something like, explain this passage to me in Tibetan, and everything that I've shown you today is kicking around in the far right there. It's all there to be had. It just needs to be found out, and what the agents do is do a little bit more proactive step in digging that stuff out. Okay, so in terms of the impact of Gen AI, and I am keeping an eye on, I know Alex is doing quite his job, even though we started late, and no instructions were given on the time of your talk either. So
you're over the period.
So yeah. Okay, Alex. In view of our friendship, I'm really going to wrap this up soon. Okay, so Martin Casado, one of my favorite VCs, says. The internet reduced the cost of distribution to zero. Gen AI reduces the cost of generation to zero. So reducing the cost of content generation to zero may be also Gen AI's biggest downside, which reminded me of a quote by Nietzsche that I had the hardest time, in time all my virtues became vices, my vices, something like that. So I asked Claude, and Claude found the quote. In the long run, my virtues proved to be most dangerous vices. And this perfectly illustrates the problem of Gen AI because this is total confabulation. Nietzsche didn't say anything like that at all. You can go to Beyond Good and Evil and epigrams and those, and bless its heart, perplexity caught Claude's mistake, and a careful reading confirms it. So, and it's not like Anthropic or Google or OpenAI are like, oh, hallucination, confabulate, what? No, it's like, basically I'll tell you, if you want chatbots that turn a parking ticket into a sonnet in style of Shakespeare, we have to continue with hallucination. That creativity is all part of it. And, but I just want to finish by saying we can eliminate hallucination in these tools. So, in summary, can AI assist Buddhist studies? For search, I showed Perplexity AI and Mitra Search. For reading, I showed you Notebook LM, Modern Languages, for Modern Languages, Mitra, for primary languages. Reflection, it'll give you lots of ideas. You can judge where you like them or not. Expositing, these AI tools can help us with composition as well as help us with our translations. And I gave you some vision of a Buddhist studies personal tutor. Now, just my final slide, Alex, before you attack me. I encourage you to try these tools. It's much easier to experiment with them to speculate or philosophize about them. I encourage you to put your work online and freely accessible. I do. This is going to help advance the world of knowledge. Yeah, the World Wide Web has a lot of junk. These tools spend a lot of time trying to sort the chaff from the grain there. The World Wide Web is what we make it. We have created a field of text and document analysis, and if we're going to have a dialogue, we've got to learn your vocabulary, and we're trying, but you also need to become familiar with ours. And maybe the last thing I really want to get across was data is so important to progress in using these tools for Buddhist studies. Marcus, and I'm looking exactly at you. Find it, catalog, digitize it, e-text it. I think that the value of data collection has been overshadowed in Buddhist studies by, philological perspectives and interpretive methods, but something like creating a central corpus of Sanskrit and Tibetan e-texts would greatly advance the field and be much more lasting than expositing on the latest topic du jour. So I hope we'll see data collection and curation is raised to a top level. And thank you.
One brief comment, Kurt. I do agree that the need there to have a well-curated corpus of e-texts in Sanskrit, I completely agree. I mean, what I see a lot happening that people have their own private collections. It makes a huge difference what people have access to. Of course, Gretel has done a great job in this, but there are zillion collections beyond Gretel that people have individually. If we had a central way of curating text, people adding to this, I'm thinking of my friends in Hamburg who are sitting on a trove of treasures that nobody has access to, only the few lucky ones. I completely agree with. For Sanskrit, it definitely would make a difference. Thank you, Kurt, for the thoughtfulness in the talk. Please.
Thanks, Kurt. Terrific talk. So since this is sort of just kind of a broader sort of philosophical question, because we brushed aside the sort of the more interpretive stuff. Obviously, these are very effective and very powerful tools. And obviously, every scholar, including any junior scholar making their way up, through the ranks, would greatly benefit from them. But this sort of raises a broader kind of philosophical question. The Buddhist tradition is a live tradition, right? So the whole point of engaging critically with this literature is to generate new ideas, to adapt these ideas to the context and the problems of today. But it seems to me here that the work of primarily focusing on the textual tradition turns the tradition itself into some sort of object of worship. So the idea is that, well, we don't really care about the relevance of Buddhist ideas to various contexts today. We really care about making sense of this text as best we can, and the tools that we now have at our disposal allow us to do so. My question is okay, so we have these tools for data extraction, for finding out patterns in the vast body of literature, and so to what use do we put them for the scope of advancing the current conversation on the significance of Buddhist studies and Buddhism more broadly?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I guess I'm supposed to hold this too. But in some sense, this is above my pay grade, right? I mean, I'm an amateur Buddhologist. I look at what I've going back to my days at Indiana. I saw what people were doing. I did this kind of much objective study, which put text and history as number one and number two. That's my, you might say, customer base. That's what I've seen people do my whole career. Berkeley puts a lot of emphasis on philology, digging into original sources and so forth, maybe a little less on the interpretive or methodological aspect. That's the group that I'm trying to reach. If suddenly the whole field turns on its head and says, no, it's all about interpretation, Buddha was just a guy, another philosopher, interesting, but there are a lot of philosophers, let's put that all in context. Okay, that's a whole different problem statement than I've attacked in my talk. Yeah.
Thank you, Kurt.
Thank you, Professor Kurt, for your insights here.
Now, are you going to bargain about a midterm grade? Because whenever I hear professor, I know that's a bad sign.
I'm trying to show you respect. I'm actually faculty at UC Berkeley in AI and product management.
Okay.
So here's my thought. I've studied Buddhism non-academically. So I'm trying to view this from the middle way of Buddhism. Not an absolute no versus AI, and not an absolute yes without guardrails. And you ended your talk basically with, we can prevent the hallucinations. Mm-hmm. And then on prior slides, you also talked about showing some helpful examples on data that's coming out. I think the point that I wanted to comment on is that if AI is interpreted as machines approximated by not only human intelligence, but human bias, I think we can pay more attention to the bias and misunderstandings of the original writers and translators of these Buddhist texts, because the machine will then learn that bias and misunderstanding, pass it off to us in more subtle ways than the Nishiki example. For example, sutras are noticeably biased in gender. So these are harms we should really look out for. So anyone who's interested in this, to me, highly recommended, if you haven't read already, Unmasking AI by Dr. Joy Buolamwini. She's testified in front of Congress multiple times, founder of Algorithmic Justice League. She's talked about the harms of AI, including people being thrown in jail.
To your question, we're running short.
Yeah, was there a question in there?
No,
We're welcome this as a comment, but.
Yeah, I preface this was a comment.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. So we have one question from Bob Miller, who is there remotely. Bob, it's not your turn yet, but we are happy to field your question. Please. Tell us.
Yes. Okay. So I just had a quick question. Thanks, Kurt, for your presentation, by the way. It's lovely to see you. I thought that was really interesting how you're talking about the fine tuning and then the further development of these, these technologies through the use of the RAG, the retrieval augmented generation software. So that's what my question is about. On the slide that you showed, that this process of RAG goes through, onto the World Wide Web, including organizations such as the one that I work for, 84,000. I was just wondering, you also mentioned that you're an investor in Perplexity AI. So what kind of discussion has there been around the compensation for the use of these training resources in for-profit applications like Perplexity AI? Thanks.
So is where you're headed, like Perplexity AI is using 84,000's data, for example, shouldn't they be paying for it?
That is the broad philosophical question I mean to raise. 84,000 and Perplexity AI are simply examples of that.
Did you want me to pay for it? Well, I'm not sure where we're headed. No, honestly, I'm not sure. I get the very broad scope of your question, which is a good one. And again, it's a Pamela Samuelson kind of question. I mean, I think the good news is, the people I see in this room have been so helpful. I see nothing but people who've, after mainly right out of the bat helpful, maybe one organization or two is grumbling now and then. But so I think everything we're doing is with blessing, and we're charging zero for it. So I don't know how we would pay. If you want to, so that's us, that's Meet Research. Now, if you want to go to something like Perplexity, yeah, we see the New York Times suing OpenAI. I think there's also a similar case now against Perplexity and so forth. I don't know that it's really to our benefit to try to sort that out today. I'm happy to talk to a reviewer, but I'll even buy it. But
yeah, I of course don't think we could resolve this today, but nevertheless, given the implications of your talk, I thought it was an important issue to raise for our congregation.
I think for what we're doing, I think it's important that we stay on good terms and don't feel we're misusing the data that we're using beyond. And so I think that's the scope of the world that I live in. Is that satisfactory or?
I'm not sure how to answer that question.
Okay, we have time. You're talking later, so.
So our next speaker is Megan Howard, who doesn't need an introduction here. She's a wonderful product of our program. These days, a postdoc in Yale, and now a newly minted assistant professor at NYU, which we are very happy and proud of. Please, Megan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to have this invitation. I'm really glad to meet a lot of people in person that I've been corresponding with in various ways. So I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you for all the hard work that went into this event. And thank you for taking these very serious topics seriously, which I know everyone in this room is doing in their own way. So, okay. We humans create our tools, and we recreate ourselves through their use, actually. Every tool comes with a set of possible uses, and through habituation to the tool, our horizon of needs and wants comes more and more to resemble the tool's horizon of applications. If you have a clock, you can expect people to be on time. If you have heard someone play the trumpet, it is much easier to dream of playing one yourself. If you or someone you know has an atom bomb, a mushroom cloud hovers over every single political decision. And so the questions that I am interested in are, how will machine translation reshape us? What kind of world will it build? And these are not easy questions to answer, and most of our attempts will miss the mark. But we have a moral duty to let serious reflection guide our adoption of new tools. And critical reflection should also countenance the possibility of rejecting specific tools or specific applications. This weekend is devoted to considering exciting new possibilities, magical possibilities that are materializing in our field on an almost daily basis due to a lot of hard work and committed effort. But if the middle way lies at the center of two extremes, we need to hear from the devil's advocate. So my job today is to argue hard for an opposite extreme, and Google Notebook will probably not like my talk. I came to this conversation formed and nourished by two great intellectual traditions, Buddhist scholasticism and academic humanism. And I speak today in a double voice, directed simultaneously at practicing Buddhists and secular academics. This makes for a very unconventional academic talk. But the two groups are increasingly entangled, and it is ultimately Buddhists who have the most at stake in this discussion. A Buddhist analysis of technology and translation is also relatively straightforward. It is in the academy where the entanglements get tricky. So while I am trying to provoke Buddhist translators toward deeper reflection, I'm probably trying to push the humanists further. So I think it's interesting that both of us came to the question of what is Buddhist studies in our talk, trying to talk about technology. I contend that we can and should use our intellectual engagement with Buddhism to shape our academic practice. And I make these arguments not out of Buddhist piety, but as a scholar committed to the humanities and the secular study of Buddhism in the academy. I hope that the analysis of machine translation I'm about to put forward can serve as a model for how one might harness the resources of Buddhist tradition to weigh the potential benefits and risks of other technologies as well. It is sometimes asserted that tools are morally neutral, that morality lies in how they are used. But when a tool reshapes its user, it contributes to the formation of a moral agent. And so-called smart tools, tools that are trained through our use of them, represent an enmeshment of agent and instrument far surpassing any previous technology. When I cook dinner for my family, there are moral questions that arise regarding the type of fuel I'm using, the amount I'm using, and so on. But my actions don't change the nature of fire. They don't change how someone else might use fire. By contrast, every single search I perform, just to keep it simple, on Google, changes the results both myself and others will get from future searches. And over time, it changes the questions that we put into the search engine. Any use of such technology, no matter how trivial, no matter how good the ends, is helping to build a tool that will reshape myself and other users. I might use fire only to cook for my family. If someone wants to burn down a city, that's on him. I might use my digital tools for very mundane and wholesome ends, but every time I do, I am helping to rebuild the world one bite at a time. I am morally complicit, for good or bad. Every use is a moral act. So, how to answer my questions? How will machine translation reshape us? What kind of world will it build? As a historian, I would suggest that we start with a clear view of where we are coming from. How has Buddhist translation worked in the past? What lessons might its history hold for our work today? And where does technology fit in? I'm going to make 4 propositions today. Number 1, Buddhist translations, like those that fill the Chinese and Tibetan canons, are written records of oral transmissions. We can make a similar claim about the Pali Canon, actually, but today I'm focused on translation. Buddhist translation processes were traditionally structured as transmission events that work simultaneously in 2 registers: the conferral of a scriptural lineage and the inculcation of an exegetical culture. Number 3, shifting our focus to transmission over and above translation reveals 2 values that should guide translation work by both Buddhist and secular academics: good stewardship of Buddhist literature and the intentional fostering of intellectual culture. Number 4, technology's role is in furthering these values, but machine translation is likely to be detrimental to both because it elides process and commodifies the written word. Translation is a quintessentially Buddhist endeavor. If we count transpositions between Middle Indic Prakrits like Pali and Gandhari, Buddhists have been busy translating their scriptures almost from the very start. A stingier definition of translation still takes us back 1800 years to late 2nd century Han China. From that point forward, Buddhists have pursued translation at an astonishing scale, employing at least a dozen pre-modern source and target languages and building towering collections of translated literature. Buddhist translators have been some of the most prolific and accomplished in world history. In spite of the profound impacts these translations have had on societies that produce them, we generally know very little about the processes that created them. I'm currently writing a book about one of the few exceptions, a 9th century translator whose working papers survive among the manuscript finds of the Silk Road oasis of Dunhuang. My reflections on technology are anchored in a model of traditional Buddhist translation practices emerging from this book project. I don't have time to present the model fully today, but I'd be happy to flesh it out further. Here we see a rare visual depiction of a pre-modern Buddhist translation team. And of course, pre-modern Buddhist translation was almost always done in teams. We are looking at a meeting of the Tonga Imperial Sutra Translation Bureau that took place around the year 1085. Presiding over the events is the state preceptor Bai Zhiguang, the largest figure in the image, who sits unfazed to the viewer with his hands in preaching gesture. To his left and right are rows of monks with paper and writing implements. Behind them stand rows of lay officials. In the foreground are the event's patrons, the Empress Dowager Liang and her son Emperor Huizong, with a table of offerings and what appear to be scriptures in different formats. We are witness to a ritual act, a moment of dharmadana conferred by a Buddhist master under the lavish support of the imperial family. This is a ritual reenactment of the meeting of Buddha and Chakravartin, the archetypal monk and the archetypal layman, meeting in a mutual gift exchange to transmit the Dharma. I pause on this point because the donors are often left out of our accounts of the translation process, but their role offers one of the keys to understanding it. Translation is a gift. The donor uses his or her material wealth to sponsor a gift of Dharma that is ultimately transmitted by the head of the translation team to a team that is usually heavily consists of monk translators. If we didn't have inscriptions identifying this as a translation scene, we would be forgiven for thinking that we are looking at a preaching event. That's not accidental. Buddhist translation is a form of preaching, and that makes it a type of dana, a ritualized gift. Now, what can we say about the process set in motion by the donor's gift? This block print is an idealized image, but its demarcation of space betrays a clear division of labor. That is, I would argue, a fundamental structural element of the Buddhist translation process. And this division of labor can be reduced to two primary roles, expositor and translator. So I'm leaving some things out for simplicity, but we can talk about that. The expositor's job traditionally was to convey the scripture being translated. He did this primarily by reciting the scripture aloud, either from memory or based on a written source text, and then commenting on difficult terms or topics as required. In Chinese tradition, he was responsible for literally conferring the scripture with his mouth, 口授. The expositor's formal title was generally 居易, chief translator. In other words, oral exposition was so important to the translation process that the expositor was considered to be the translator, even in cases when he didn't know Chinese. The prominence of the expositor that we can see in the Tongat print transforms a translation event into a pedagogical act of oral transmission. It is focused on the product, the translation, only in an instrumental sense, as a step towards the propagation of the Buddha Dharma. Thus, the participatory nature of translation events, like the assemblies presided over by Kumarajiva with hundreds in attendance, is every bit as important as the finished translations they produced. A few centuries later, we are told that Xuanzang requested sentries to keep spectators out of his translation hall, but he delivered a 2-hour lecture every evening on the fruits of the morning's translation work. Why didn't he wait until the entire scripture was translated to lecture on it? Because the pedagogical encounter between expositor and disciples lay at the heart of the proceedings, and even in cases where translation was pursued behind closed doors, it needed to be preserved. The second member of the translation team is the translator, the team member responsible for carrying the expositor's words across the language divide, and then writing them down. Frequently in China, this seems to have been performed by a figure who, quote, received the scripture with his brush, 笔授. When we pair this so-called scribe with the expositor who conferred with his mouth, we see the start and end points of the Buddhist translation process, its source and target. A scripture was transmitted from master to disciple in an act of transmission that transmutes oral tradition into written record. The finished translation is a receipt. It documents the fact of a successful transmission. The moment of linguistic transposition occurs in the mysterious encounter of expositor and translator, master and disciple. It is a meeting of minds, expressed aloud with their voices, and finally captured in written words, the minutes of the proceedings. In my book, I plan to argue that Buddhist translation can be seen as a transposition of Indian Buddhist pedagogy into a novel language environment. In other words, the expositors largely adhered to an Indian pedagogical paradigm. They conducted the affairs of the translation hall in the mode of a traditional Indian Buddhist classroom rooted in practices of orality. But the translators wrote this down in formats that were recognizable to a local audience. So translation is not only a meeting of master and disciple, it is a meeting of Indian orality and local writing, scripture received in a local idiom. Now, the written records of translation projects go well beyond the finished translation. We also find things like word lists, outlines, word-by-word glosses, and introductory overviews. All of this constitutes what I call the exegetical apparatus, a matrix of supporting materials that were produced in support of the initial moment of translation, but that could continue to circulate after the translation was complete. In other words, the production of commentary was an integral part of the translation process. And I've just put a sampling of these sets that I've discovered in Dunhuang up on the slide. Now, for the translators in the room, the process of witnessing and assisting in the production of this translation hall exegesis did something very important. It forged local scholias. In a 9th century list Of over 100 early Tibetan writings about Buddhism, the vast majority of which are now lost, title after title betrays an explicit link to a specific translation project. So if you don't read Tibetan, what I didn't translate is you get the title of a scripture, and then you get something like memo or gloss or commentary. And then I've highlighted names so you can see the frequency where we have an author's name attached. So this is a 9th century list of the earliest Tibetan writings about Buddhism, the vast majority of which are now lost. And in cases where a work is signed, we find the names of famous translators, Yeshe Day, Birotsana, and Paltsek. And we find the very same set of names attached to the very first treatises that expand their scope beyond a single scripture, some of which still survive in the Tenjur. The full development of this trajectory is evident in the exposition of commentarial writing that was stimulated by the second wave of Tibetan translations, the so-called new translations. And we see the same thing in the prodigious exegetical output of Kumarajiva's and Xuanzang's disciples, as well as by entire generations of Chinese Buddhists responding to new translations of scriptures like the Nirvana Sutra and the Lotus Sutra. Translation projects produced imposing physical embodiments of the Buddhist canon. They formulated the first indigenous commentarial genres, and they trained the first generations of local Buddhists capable of reading and interpreting the Buddha Dharma. The great exegetical traditions of Chinese and Tibetan Buddhism were born in the translation hall and came of age digesting its fruits. The translation of Buddhist texts is properly seen as an act of transmission operating in two registers. The expositor's recitation of the central scripture is a spiritual authorization, initiating the disciples into a lineage of Buddhists, stretching back to the teacher with a capital T, himself, who have held that scripture in their hearts. His comments on the scripture, meanwhile, the expositor's comments, induct the translators, scribes, editors, and everyone else in the room into an intellectual tradition. They habituate patterns of reading and interpretation that likewise stretch back to the very first generation of Buddhists who received the scripture in question and passed it on to their students. From this understanding of translation, two values arise. So let's take them in turn. First is stewardship. Buddhist translation, as I have argued, is primarily the transmission of a scripture that is carried in the expositor's mind and delivered to his disciples orally. The written text documents this, but the actual content of the transmission, the spark, lies in the expositor's mind, not on the page. Each conferral of the scripture inducts the disciples who receive it into a lineage stretching back to the Buddha himself. It is a human chain of custody, an unbroken line of custodians who have upheld the scripture, who have literally kept it in mind, safeguarding it for future generations. The chain of custody bolsters a scripture's chances of being successfully transmitted, but it also keeps the transmission fresh. The expositor plants his feet in the terrain of Buddha Vachana and then looks toward the future. The lineage, passed from human to human, is what keeps the Buddha's words alive, what makes them present within the words of the scripture being transmitted, what gives the scripture meaning. The second level at which Buddhist transmission operates is almost a byproduct of the spiritual transmission, but it is the part with real legs. This is the inculcation of a scriptural culture. When the expositor conducts his exposition in the traditional Indian style, the Chinese or Tibetan disciples are exposed not just to the words of the scripture, but to an intellectual tradition. Sitting at the master's feet, they absorb sets of practices and procedures, attitudes and norms. When they then use local formats and genres to write down a variety of records of the exposition, they begin the process of naturalizing Buddhist pedagogy to their time and place. In the translation hall, we see the birth of the local pedagogical culture that will carry the transmission forward. Timeless Buddhist commentary delivered in a new mode. If the intangible spark of transmission is what makes Buddha Vachana meaningful, it is the intellectual culture forged by preaching and translation that makes that meaning intelligible. For modern-day Buddhist translators, and here I'm speaking primarily of religious translators, the implications of all of this are clear, and to a large extent are already familiar concerns. Most importantly, we must be careful not to short-circuit the transmission process. This is messy in practice. For many scriptures, the transmission lineage is no longer intact. Seeking proper instruction on a text takes time and energy that are often in short supply. For certain types of texts, it can be hard to find a qualified expositor. But letting transmission guide our work starts with simply acknowledging its importance, with seeing ourselves as custodians of the scripture and the tradition, intermediaries indebted to the Buddhist past and accountable to the Buddhist future. This also suggests that a translation team embedded in a pedagogical context should be our ideal. We won't always attain the ideal, but it is important to hold it up as such. This means multi-ethnic, multilingual teams like those encouraged by the initial rounds of the 84,000 project, bringing together learned lineage masters, translators, and skilled stylists, that's a group that I left out above, in the target language. It also means that we should consciously encourage scriptural study and exposition, and perhaps even public translation events in the tradition of Kumarajiva. This is easier said than done in most cases, but again, it is important to uphold the ideal. If we want the Dharma to take root in new settings, this is what it will take. Buddhists also need to reflect explicitly on the type of pedagogical context we build. It is not by accident that translation halls across the Buddhist world adopted Indian pedagogical models. In China, where a sophisticated scholarly culture had developed long before Buddhism's arrival, Buddhists didn't need to adopt Indian practices, but they did. In the pre-modern world, translating Buddhist scripture involved adopting a Buddhist intellectual mode. The assimilation of Buddhist culture was just as important as its content. The medium and the message are interdependent. Academic translators do not stand in the same relation to Buddha Vachana, and yet they too have now entered the scriptural chain of custody. We rarely pause to acknowledge the miracle that anything has been transmitted ever, let alone orally and over the course of thousands of years. But it is a miracle that we have any Buddhist literature at all, and what we do have is entirely thanks to centuries of labor and care on the part of the Buddhist Sangha and its patrons. To have non-Buddhists as part of this chain of custody is something unprecedented prior to the modern age, a point that merits much more reflection than the field of Buddhist studies has given it. But if Buddhist literature is worth a scholar's sustained attention, it is worth her stewardship. We owe the past generations thanks for producing and preserving texts that move us, that inspire us, that provoke us, and we honor their past sacrifices by consciously imparting to future generations texts that we have found to be of value ourselves. Transmission is part of the humanistic tradition too. Seeing ourselves as a present bridge between past and future unsettles the predominant mode of academic translation, one which at this point is also widespread among Buddhist translators. I call it the one-man band model. Here, the virtuoso philologists, and I see myself here, the virtuoso philologists, cut from the same cloth as Indiana Jones, though probably destined for much less fun, valiantly recovers a lost classic and then translates it alone in a room, single-handedly returning the work to the world's attention, newly embedded in a critical apparatus that provides the key to all manners of interpretation. This is an enlightenment, with a capital E, fantasy, one deeply imprinted by Protestant approaches to reading and scripture. It is further reinforced in the academy by professional demands for a constant stream of cutting-edge insights measured in lines of the CV. We don't necessarily need to start working in teams, but we really should shift the narratives that we tell about our work. We can do this with simple steps like making it the norm to cite dictionaries, reference works, and textual corpora, technological tools, according greater value to translations in a tenure dossier, in writing the nameless and faceless native informants who seeded our discipline back into its history. We all stand on the shoulders of giants, and it bears remembering. Now, when it comes to technology, its proper intersection with the translation of Buddhist texts should be in furthering the values I've identified, according to me. The transmission of Buddhist literature and the fostering of an intellectual culture that can receive it. I'll also note that while Buddhists have often been at the forefront of distribution technologies, the technology of the translation hall has been quite limited and stable. As I argued at the outset, tools always encode values, and using them always changes us. So we need to reflect explicitly on the values that are encoded in the machine translation and its possible applications. So there's a strong form of machine translation that proposes replacement of the human translator altogether. I haven't encountered anyone this weekend who's suggesting that we adopt that model, but it is ongoing. Like, you can go to academia.edu and find translations that people have posted that they haven't vetted. So this is happening. There are also much more common, many varieties of machine-assisted translation being proposed, in which human translators consult an application as a reference, or what's called a pony. But in all cases, I see two interrelated challenges emerging from the use of machine translation: an elision of process and a commodification of text. By eliding human confrontation with the text, machine translation cannot but foreclose on the development of local traditions of Buddhist scholarship, be they Buddhist or academic. It is precisely the friction of the translation hall and the seminar room that turns out scholars of caliber. It is precisely the experience of repeatedly struggling to understand a text, of watching understanding emerge from the application of a specific set of culturally embedded practices, of seeing this process modeled by expositor or professor again and again. It is again the friction of the cultural encounter between foreign master and local recipient, between foreign pedagogy and local record keeping, that forges a local iteration of Buddhist scholasticism. And it is through the friction of the pedagogical encounter between student and teacher that the intangible spark of scriptural transmission materializes on the teacher's lips and is transmuted into the student's written record. The only possible shortcuts to this process end in incomplete transmission. Transmission takes time. Whether our goal is to establish the Dharma in the West or the study of Buddhism in the academy, if we hope for a stable, long-lasting transmission, that takes time. The translations of the Chinese and Tibetan canons each spanned more than 500 years, and they were working at it much harder than we have been. It takes time to translate, time to digest. The process of assimilation, adaptation, cannot be rushed. It is only by repeating the moment of cultural encounter again and again over the course of multiple generations that the process is fully worked through. Finished translations testify that this process is underway. They do not independently constitute it. Our focus should be on supporting the process over and above its products, and that requires time. We are building a cathedral. None of us will see the culmination of our efforts in this lifetime. Our job is to set up the institutional structures that might ensure the project's longevity, to train scholars and translators, and to model the types of scholarship required. In other words, our job is to allow time, to set up circumstances that will allow the process to work itself through, to give scholars space to translate, space to digest, space to share their learning with others. And emergent technologies, unfortunately, work directly against this. In a lighting process, machine translation nudges us towards a culture of speed, which is then ramified by the pace of technological change itself. The translator finds herself in a shifting landscape where the only constant is ever increasing speed, when what she needs is stability and time. Machine translation might help us translate more text faster, it might. But if it does, we will likely end up with a pile of texts and no one qualified to read or interpret them. The deep meaning of those texts, which has traditionally been as a proof of a successful transmission, will be fundamentally reinscribed, their life force drained. Now, when it comes to stewardship, machine translation raises concerns that go to the heart of the nature of the written word. Because large language models must be trained on data, machine translation cannot but reinforce a profoundly impoverished and desacralized view of the written word. If a large language model is to be capable of translating Buddhist texts, it has to be fed a large set of Buddhist texts. Note that, it does not read them, it eats them. Is it our place to take cherished scriptural canons, the pinnacle achievements of multiple Buddhist civilizations, produced and preserved with real blood, sweat, and tears? Is it our place to turn these into training data, to reinscribe them as computer inputs and outputs, to shove them into pipelines? Should we allow them to be scraped from online repositories like clumps of flesh stuck to rawhide, like mud from our shoes, like gum from the sidewalk? How does the scraping of training data compare with the Buddhist views of Scripture, In Tibetan Buddhism, when you formally take refuge in the Dharma, you are counseled to venerate even the tiniest fragments of writing, because a single letter can embody the scriptures. I have seen people rub out the brand names on their shoes to avoid walking on the written word. I have been taught special mantras and mudras to lift the shadows of prayer flags off the ground. You might object that this is special pleading, that text is text. But I think that argument only betrays how desensitized we have become to the magic, the holiness of the written word, scripture or otherwise. My husband was born in a remote nomadic region. He didn't see a car until he was 9 years old. But he talks about the first time he saw someone read aloud from a book. It was magic, and it fired in him a fierce desire to learn how to do that himself. And by the way, it wasn't a Buddhist book. It was an early printed edition of the Gesar epic. For Buddhists, the sacredness of the Dharma is so strong that it extends to the most mundane forms of writing, a shoe company's logo. For cynical moderns, writing has become so prosaic that we have no second thoughts about commodifying the pinnacles of human wisdom, the treasures that transmit and sustain cultures, compiled over generations, transmitted with care, the best humanity has to offer, scraped in 30 seconds. The questions I have posed are not futile. It has been publicly asserted that the machine translation of Buddhist texts is inevitable, and indeed it is already underway. But inevitability is simply a function of the timely convergence of causes and conditions. And here Kurt and I were both thinking about cake. The cake is only baked when it is baked. The fruit ripens in its own time, but the baker makes the batter, chooses the pan, sets the temperature, and then waits. The farmer decides which seed to plant and how and when to nurture it. Even when the cake is done and the fruit is ripe, each of us has a choice whether or not to eat. We build the tools, we choose if and how to use them. Now, my colleagues who are proponents of machine translation say, send us your training data. And I respectfully am forced to disagree. I say, don't do it. I'm sorry. Stop sharing your data. Stop using the translators. Maybe stop making e-texts. Stop outsourcing the privilege of reading these riches. Put your telescope down. I once heard Michael Nyland urge her audience to shop at local bookstores and not at Amazon. Do not curate the disappearance of a world you will miss, she said. And I will repeat that. Do not curate the disappearance of a world you will miss. Both Buddhists and academics need to think carefully about the type of world that is built from our engagement with Buddhist literature. A bodhisattva learns all disciplines, says Shantideva. A bodhisattva can wield tools with skill. But the Dharma is virtuous in the beginning, the middle, and the end. And this means that the ends cannot justify the means. In the case of machine translation, we cannot swap out the virtuous middle and hope to maintain the same relationship between beginning and end. More broadly, digital technologies divorce sensory input from embodied experience. Their use isolates the user in a reflective pool of self-infatuation and conceptual proliferation that launches an unremitting assault on our powers of focused attention. Technology firms increasingly hide the real-world social and environmental costs of their products out of sight. Distribution is not no cost. Perplexity is not no cost. The brave new world is here, but Buddhist thinkers have reflected deeply, perhaps more deeply than any others, on questions like the role of sense perception and subjectivity, the destructiveness of ego obsession and conceptual echo chambers, the healing and liberative powers of attention and how to cultivate it, and the interdependence of causes and effects. Students of Buddhist thought do not have to help build utopian dreamscapes of solipsistic sensory deprivation. The Buddha's entire project was to help beings get themselves out of the giant messes they themselves have created. Those of us who have been exposed to it should stand up and lead the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This invites, obviously, comments and questions. If I may start, Megan, I'm not sure whether it's thinking about the moment when the Vedic tradition was committed to writing. There was an enormous resistance to the idea that the sacred word should be committed to paper. So couldn't one argue that somehow there was a comparable moment? Also, I'm thinking about handwritten manuscripts in India. At some stage, of course, in the larger East Asian world, there was block print. Yeah. Also, at that point, one could have the same kind of argument. I think the Vedic one is more powerful. Thinking the process of learning the text by heart, how much is lost when it's committed to paper suddenly? Couldn't one somehow? Sorry, I'm just trying to challenge you gently. Yeah. Wouldn't one make the argument that this is a little bit what we are negotiating here? You know, to use Michael Reddich's term, that, you know, the question whether this is a telescope or not, which you nicely picked up in your talk. Thank you.
Yeah, I have two responses to that. I don't have all of the answers, so this is the current state of my thinking. One is that, especially in the humanities, we have spent the last several decades studying the ramifications of the changes in technology. And so in previous eras, we didn't, I'm not sure how much reflection in the moment was going on besides just anxiety about, introduction of print or something. But now we have robust bodies of scholarship showing the societal changes that, same thing for the movement from orality to writing. But the second point is maybe those people were right. Maybe oral culture is better. I mean, we were talking at breakfast, actually, about what to do with giant libraries, I mean, I was saying, has anyone gone to archive.org in the last 10 days? It's gone. So you just lost, it's coming back, but, it's down. So this is what happens. We put things online, and then we don't have the book, and then the site is not accessible. And so does that increase access? I don't know. But then, what's the old model? The old model is we have these amazing people in the room here who own thousands of books, and then that creates a certain suffering in its own right. So, what's the solution? Well, offload your books to archive.org and then, okay, but maybe the solution is let's start memorizing again. So I just trying to provoke, but I mean, it just seems, it seems to us that printing is good. That's because we are several hundred years into printing being the norm. It seems to us that we can't imagine the world without writing. That's because we are, 1,000 years into that experience. So, but who's to say,
I mean, part of what I really appreciate about what you're pointing to is that there's a certain unpredictability about where this could go. And I just wanted to make a short comment, sort of sprung in my mind by what you just said about reading. One of the interesting things about reading is that it literally changes the human brain also. So in cultures in which you learn to read, it alters especially the regions of the brain that are associated with facial recognition. So it actually takes over parts of that part of the brain, and you basically are not as good at facial recognition. So we know there are there are other changes in the prefrontal cortex. We know that happens. But the other thing that's really interesting that we see right now with technology is the effects that it's having on young people. So there's a debate about this, but if some of you may have read the book The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, there's also really concrete changes that are happening both neurophysiologically and psychologically in young people that are the result of being raised basically with devices, especially in Western countries. So I think one of our challenges here really is to say, what is the downstream, what are the almost unpredictable effects of the downstream use of this type of technology? I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but I'm saying that part of what I hear you pointing to is what really is the downstream, what are the downstream effects that we don't even see right now?
Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. That was lovely and very provocative. I'm confused, though, by your use of the term Buddha Dharma. So we have, obviously, as you know, we have certain texts that were translated multiple times into China. They were not translating the same text. The underlying text was evolving. All of Mahayana texts, at least some people would claim, were not written by the Buddha. Somebody was making this stuff up. And so there seems to be, you seem to have, the way you talk would lead someone who didn't know you to believe that you thought that there was some fixed Buddha Dharma there somewhere, and we should be very careful in handling it. I think of Paul Karras, he created a book, The Gospel of Buddha. They were so-called translations from the Buddhist canon, but he knew no Asian languages at all. That text was translated into Asian languages and was adopted in monastic curriculum in Asia. And they did it because it was speaking to this is early 20th century. It was a Buddha Dharma that was speaking to them. It was what they needed to hear, in the same way that the Buddha Dharma has always been changing and evolving. And so it's that notion of Buddha Dharma that confuses me.
I think that's my point, is that it's about transmission. So it's about a living tradition transmitting what's of value. And that shifts and changes, but there's a gesture towards something timeless, I'm not talking about, I'm not talking about physical instantiations of a specific scripture, for sure. But I think, I think what I'm trying to get at is, well, what is transmission? But I think that, and I think that part of our problem has been this focus, and I'm a textualist, okay, I love text, but part of our problem has been our obsession with the text, and there's actually this whole thing going on around the text. So when you look at that, it makes perfect sense that texts change over time. That's what humans do. But I don't think that from a Buddhist point of view invalidates the transmission. That's precisely the point, is that you have some kind of, even as this world is changing, you have some kind of link to the Buddha. And I'm not saying the historical Buddha, who may or may not have been a contemporary of Ashoka, just to reference a talk that I really would have liked to have heard.
Another question from...
Okay, yeah. So thank you very much for this presentation. Can you hear me, yeah? because I think you really brought to light something that it was a sort of latent tension or something hidden in the conversation so far. And so it leads me to ask a series of related questions, but feel free to address in whichever order you want. So first of all, do you think that Buddhist translation is a valid category of academic inquiry? Buddhist translation. And the second thing, they're all related. Do you think that Buddhist study should be the study of Buddhist literature? And is studying Buddhist texts something that should approach Buddhist texts primarily as Buddhist entities or just as texts from which all sorts of notification of truth should be extracted?
Right. So this is one of my, this is what brings us to what are we doing in the humanities? I don't know. But I think Buddhism has a lot to tell us about what translation is, and maybe what Buddhism has to say doesn't apply to every instance of translation we can come up with in history. But I feel like, I don't, it's not because I happen to be a Buddhist translator, but I feel like Buddhism has a lot to say about translation that we haven't heard so much. If you go read translation theory, it's, we don't hear that much about it. So I feel like there's ways to add, bring this into the conversation. So I feel like if you're really taking your object of study seriously, then you should do it. It's just, it's a matter of respect to let it inform your broader thinking about the world.
Okay, so I have a short comment and then a question.
Yeah.
So my comment is, actually just like, I've been actually coordinating an army of like hundreds of people scraping, this translation. So I'm really sorry to hurt your feeling, with that. So, and, but thank you very much for, your presentation was really, really touching. And it made me, you mentioned Gesar.
Yeah.
As a kid, actually, I grew up like reading Gesar, and Gesar epic made me fall in love with equitation.
Yeah.
And I really, with like Genghis Khan, Gesar, etc. Like always loved, horses. And listening to your talk made me feel okay. So basically, it felt like the art of equitation, and maybe as a means of transportation in the Bay Area and around here in 2024. So so there's like, this thing, okay, so it's really nice, but is it really relevant? And my question is translation, the main goal of these scriptures? Is it like, the end, or is it just a means, to have text, that, then can be read and used in different, formats? But I think you're really focused on translation as a means of, actually studying Dharma. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think that these are a means for transmission. So maybe stepping outside of academia, but I mean, what I want for the humanities is I want people transmitting things of value to their students. I feel like we don't talk about that much, but okay, going back to Buddhism, I think that translation is a means of transmission. And that's why we have these things where we have these amazing translation projects that then get put behind glass. And the tradition doesn't have a problem with that. It's because the job is done. Those scriptures are now alive in the community. And so it doesn't matter if you're reading them or not, I mean, that's a strong form of it, but I think there's something there, that we, and that's why philologists are always like, well, but nobody read this, because it was translated, it was transmitted, it's alive in the tradition. You don't have to go back to the book. I mean, of course you can, and then we see, great scholiasts who do that, it's not about producing an object that can sit on a shelf, So, and then in terms of relevance, I feel like, I know this is a tough sell, but I think that the humanities and Buddhism both have something to offer the world, and maybe it's to show a different way. There's something different that we do, and we should not be ashamed about it, and we should offer people a different way,
Sorry,
Yes, I know.
Okay, thank you. Just a short question. Thank you for this very thought-provoking and inspiring talk. I really appreciate this focus on transmission and inviting us to investigate, inquire what that may be. I was just thinking about your emphasis on time and things having to take time, a sort of natural ripening. In the so-called tradition, there's also an emphasis on speed at times, and there are many examples of amazing technology. No, at least, yeah, I think we can safely call it technology. Yeah. Yeah. So when at the same time thinking of the world as it is now, I think unless there's some major disaster, it is clear that this development will continue, and there'll be increasingly powerful artificial intelligence and so on. So is it viable? I mean, I really appreciate you considering the option of just stepping back and so forth. I think we need to take that option very seriously. But if so, then how would one at all do that? And if that stepping back is not the most compelling response to the development that's going on, if instead there's a possibility of engaging with the emerging technology, then what kind of environment is there? Is it possible to appropriate and sort of reinvent a proper environment and modes of engagement with the sacred in the same way as you have highlighted it was the case in the past?
Thank you. Yes. I think one question is, yes, there are times for speed, and then there are times for going slow. And so just to really be very consciously think that through. When do we need speed, and when do we need to just slow down? And so I've been telling my undergraduates that we're doing slow learning. You know, we have slow fashion, we have slow food. I make them buy the course reader, which they hate because they're not used to spending money on course materials anymore. And I make them bring it to class. That's part of their grades. So, you know, so first of all, just to be very conscious about, you know, when are we going which way? But then also, I think that, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on, it comes down to values. That's what I think we have to start with values. I know, like, especially in the academy, people are uncomfortable with values, but that's what's going on. We have to think about this. And so, you know, if your value is to develop sustained, focused powers of attention, how do you support that? And so for technology developers, how do you design a tool that supports that? How do you design a tool that, you know, that supports, I mean, I don't know, but, you know, if you start with the value that you're looking for, and then you look for the tool. I mean, I feel like we're all just like rushing to pick up the hammer because everybody else has one, you know, and so maybe, again, like maybe if you're in the US military, maybe you don't have a choice. Like, I don't know what's going on there. Maybe if you are running a, you know, for-profit corporation, you might not have a choice. I don't know. But in this world, like, we are already obsolete, folks. Like, just embrace it, you know? Like, and show...
Stop. Sorry, Megan. Please, the last comment.
Just a quick comment, Meg. I really appreciate the reverence for the translation traditions. That's just a wonderful, and it's indeed a very touching account. But how do we really know at the end of the day that machine learning and machine translation is not a new form of upaya for the 21st century or so for the future? And if we look back to the tradition itself, I mean, Sravaka Bhumi and the Bodhisattva Bhumi, you know, as the Bodhisattva advances along the path, high up there, one of the skills that they have to master is grammar and style. So why is it that the Bodhisattva of the 21st century can't be just a NLP programmer, someone who sort of mastered, you know, the current vocabulary of the way in which knowledge gets translated and transmitted? So why should we not see machine translation as a new form of upaya rather than as a major obstacle? Because after all, that's what ensures the survival and transmission of Buddhism. It's great capacity to adapt to new circumstances and new cultural contexts. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean that I grant that point. I mean, Shantideva says Bodhisattva, learns all disciplines. You can, Bodhisattvas can use tools. So, but my point is that we have to think very carefully about the consequences of those tools, and I think that's what a bodhisattva would do. Is like, skillful means has to be skillful. And it's not just skillful because it's popular or it's got a lot of attention, a lot of news coverage. That doesn't necessarily make something skillful. So it's about the effects when you apply the tool. Like, where does that get us?
A very good point to be continued later in the day. But there's one final comment.
If I start, we won't stop.
Okay, that also would be. Thank you very much, Mary. So our next speaker is Bob Miller, whom I'm happy to say earned his PhD also here. Before joining Berkeley, Bob had a long history of translating in the Tibetan tradition, and now he's working for 84,000. So he's of course exactly the kind of person who should or should not, that's up to Kurt or Megan to decide, who definitely has to contemplate the question whether to use the AI tools or not. Actually, how to use them. That's what I think. Okay.
Hello, everybody. All right. All right. So, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks. I'd like to, first of all, thank Bob Scharf, Kurt Koitzer, and Sebastian for inviting me to participate in this workshop. And also a special thanks to Sky and Sanjot for assisting with this last-minute technology. I had intended to come. I was very much looking forward to come. But then at the last minute, something came up and I wasn't able to. So regretfully, I have to do this remotely. So when I wrote my abstract, I intended to examine the specific choices that were made during the translation process. So from which edition to use, which dictionary to privilege, which meaning in the dictionary to go with, etc. Now, in comparing my process to the machine translation model, I was hoping to articulate a difference between the workings of human agency on the one hand and computer automation on the other. Hence the working title that I submitted, which was Human Intelligence in Buddhist Speech, where human intelligence is meant to imply and stand against artificial intelligence. But the dichotomies that I was thinking through, whether that meant agency and automation, human, machine, sort of aesthetic or computational modes of cognition, that they broke down under analysis. And so I began to realize that however interesting and important those questions are, that I should probably start thinking about something else for my topic. Now, fortunately, around the same time, Sebastian wrote to me of the need for a nuanced evaluation of machine translation, both its merits and shortcomings. And that seemed like a useful approach to take since I've worked as a professional translator from Tibetan, and translator and interpreter for nearly 25 years now. So after considering it, I thought that rendering I chose a particular word in Tibetan, which is ne, which is used here in a specific sense, or rendering rather, the Sanskrit nishraya. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I thought that this would be a good test case because, first of all, it's, excuse me, the Tibetan word ne itself is highly polyvalent in Tibetan. And it's also used to translate, according to Negi, over 75 different Sanskrit words. So, among those, we have 7 technical terms and as many as 28 different nominal uses, so distinct usages of the term. So when we have a Tibetan term ne, which could represent or could be translating any one of 75 different Sanskrit terms. And yet the meaning that I'm interested in is a relatively obscure meaning. So, for example, here Negi records the 7 technical terms for ne, giving stitihi, pratishta, adhishtanam, ayatanam, etc., even giving nishrayaha. But none of these 7 usages map onto the usage that I'm interested in. So Negi then goes on, and what we have here is basically a sort of a crude diagram that shows the 28 distinct usages of ne as a semantic field. So again, I want to emphasize that none of these usages is the usage that I'm interested in speaking about today. Here is ne. But we get a sense of the problem of polysemy the difficulty that machine translation models might face in dealing with highly polysemic words, I think is well illustrated here. So if we look at this diagram in the upper right-hand corner, you'll notice that there are a cluster of terms around physical location. So this means that there is at least one Sanskrit term translated into Tibetan with ne that means place, another one that means site, another one that means temple, monastery, earth, village, and so forth. If you go to the other side of the diagram, you see in pink that there's another cluster of terms around metaphysical concepts. So ne is translating Sanskrit words that correspond to the ideas of refuge or shelter, practice, fields of merit, place in a metaphorical sense, or path, and so forth. So what's interesting to me here, and why I chose to focus on ne for this presentation, is that I thought it represented a good test case for machine translation, to see how machine translation deals with highly polyvalent terms, especially when the desired meaning is one of the less common ones documented in our sources. So the term here is ne, as I've said several times now, which I've translated into English as support. So my interest in this term goes back over 10 years. Back to 2010, when I was living in a Tibetan monastery, serving as the Changsa or the bursar, which is a chief monastic administrator. And at the time, I didn't have a lot of free time. The free time that I did have was spent in a monastery office in front of a computer. And then at the same time, I was running out of money that I had saved while working as an interpreter in Australia. So 84,000 had recently begun offering translation grants, and I applied for one. But when I wrote, I had asked to, or I rather had expressed an interest in translating the old tantras, because that was sort of my personal interest at the time. But John Canty, one of the editorial chiefs, encouraged me to translate from the Vinaya, since at that point I was already a monk of 10 years standing. So in the end, I decided to start at the beginning, and I chose the first text in the Vinaya, which also happens to be the first text in the Derge Kangyur, which is the chapter on going forth. It's a chapter about how men and women, or boys and girls, enter the order, how they become monks, how they go forth from from the household into the homeless life of a monastic. And in this particular case, as I'm translating this text, the chapter on going forth, about 48 folios in, I encounter a description in which the Buddha identifies 5 types of preceptor. And the one of the types of preceptors is known as the preceptor who gives ne. or as we see here, support. Now, I didn't know this definition from the Great Tibetan Chinese Dictionary at that point. I didn't know that ne in this case referred to the guru or an instructor. I took ne, in fact, in one of its many other usages, in one of its many other meanings. In particular, I thought it was referring to the material support that monastics rely upon in the form of shelter, food, clothing, and medicine. So I was working on the assumption, which I think probably most machine translations do, is you kind of go with the most common meaning of the word ne and then go from there. So in this particular case, however, or rather, so what I want to do now is to then look at 5 instances of this word ne. And what I've done is I've tested, I've selected, actually, I tested about 20 to 30 passages, tested both Mitra and Claude on 20 to 30 passages containing this usage of the word ne, or support. That is to say, support as moral support. And I just want to go through and look at, analyze the results that it provides. So in the next 5 slides we look at, I want to emphasize that I'm not going to be addressing every problematic aspect of the machine translation. In fact, almost every single instance of machine translation contains at least 2 or 3, if not more, issues that I think an editor would flag. I'm only going to be looking at how machine translations deal with this use of the word ne. So, the first usage of ne here comes from a topic heading in the chapter on going forth. So as I mentioned, this is a chapter on ordination. And after about 20 folios in which the text is describing what are called the rules of customary conduct for the teacher and the student, let me say that again. These 20 folios essentially outline the relationship of the teacher and student in terms of the rules that govern their relationship, what the student is to do for the teacher and what the teacher is to do for the student in turn. These 20 folios also contain 21 different sets of qualifications required for a monk or nun, in fact, because there are nun preceptresses or instructresses, the qualifications that they require. So this section, again, all about the relationship between the teacher and the student, culminates in the phrase "negikap zokso." So as you can see, I translated this as the section on support. Both Mitra and Claude took ne, rather, however, in one of its more common uses as place. The second usage I looked at was that of ne jimpa, which means the giver of support. And in this case, support is, again, moral support. This is not material support, but the moral support given by a teacher to the student. So this particular passage, or in this particular passage, rather, the monk Upasena has taken a disciple after just a single year as a monk. And when the Buddha is later informed of this, he immediately rules that those who have been ordained for under 10 years may not do 5 things. And these 5 things you can see here are noted in the Tibetan as well as the translations. So first of all, a new monk or nun should not allow goings forth. They should not grant ordination. They should not give support. They should not accept charge of novices, nor should they live independently on their own. In short, new monks and nuns are prohibited from doing 3 things. They can't admit anyone new to the Sangha. they can't train anyone else, and they can't live independently. So what's important here is the third usage, where it says ne jimparja, literally meaning they should not act as a giver of support. Now Claude, again, takes ne, in this case, to mean a place to stay. Where Mitra hallucinates. So as you can see, it essentially isn't sure how to understand or interpret the word ne, and so it goes through a series of options, all the different things that that ne might mean. And what you see here on the screen is perhaps a fifth or a sixth of the total output that Mitra gave, and in the end, never finished. So this is an instance of hallucination that Kurt earlier said that can't be fixed. But at least at the present time, it remains an issue. Thirdly, the word nepe. So this means in reliance. The chapter on going forth describes the duties of these 5 instructors and says specifically that the instructor who gives support is the instructor with whom one lives in reliance upon for even a single night. Here we have 2 issues that I just want to focus on, and I apologize if it's confusing to see the different colors and everything on the screen. Starting on the left-hand side, we have the Tibetan Ne Jimpe Lopen, which means an instructor who gives support. Again, Mitra and Cloud take ne, support, to mean shelter or accommodation. Perhaps more importantly, though, is the fact that both Mitra and Claude elide or omit the phrase nepe, or in reliance. And this leads to a crucial misinterpretation, because without this phrase in reliance, the instructor who gives support is simply somebody in whose house you stay for a single night. But what's actually crucial here is that you're staying together with them because you have entered into a relationship of reliance. So in this case, the elision of nepe, or the omission of nepe, however we choose to describe it, leads to a crucial misinterpretation. This is partly seen in the Sanskrit, which is seen in the bottom of the screen as well. Now here again, we have 2 different, as in the Tibetan, we see the word ne appearing twice. I just want to focus now on the use in purple. So in Sanskrit, it says Nishraya Tvena Pratyupastanam, which is rendering, or digesting, I should say, the Tibetan nepe dupa yino. So once again, neither Mitra nor Claude understand how Nishraya is being used here. It's Nishraya with the abstract tva, so going from the act of reliance to reliance in an abstract sense, with the instrumental particle ena corresponding to the pratyupastanam. Pratyupastanam here meaning proximity to or living close to. So it is, the idea here is that the instructor who gives support is not just simply somebody you stay with for a night, but rather somebody that you enter into a relationship of reliance upon, even if that relationship lasts for only a single night. I have 2 more uses here, and then we'll move on. So use 4 is that of minepar, or independently. This is used in an adverbial sense. Now, living independently is the last of the 5 things that are prohibited to new monks and nuns, right? We saw how they're not allowed to grant goings forth or ordination. They can't train other people. They can't accept charge of novices. And finally, they cannot live independently. What that means is that no matter where a new monk or nun goes, they must seek a ne, a moral support, to oversee their training, with whom they either live or live in close proximity to. And here, I thought this was curious because the nepa, as you can see in the bottom half of the screen, is still related to the Sanskrit nishraya via the ni prefix and the shri verbal root. Note that the shri verbal root is also the same one in sharanam, as in going for refuge. We say Buddha sharanam gacchami and so forth. So this is the same shri, ni shri. But here it's being used a nishrita. It is nishrita being the past passive participle, who has relied upon. Anishrita, one who is not relied upon, so by extension, independently. Neither Mitra nor Claude do very well with the Tibetan, as you can see. And when it comes to the Sanskrit, Claude renders it correctly as independently. And Mitra gives what I think is a very defensible translation, also one that I have gone through, is live without support. So at least in this particular usage, both Claude and Mitra did better on the Sanskrit than they did on the Tibetan. And then the fifth use here is that of ne chete, which is a gerundial phrase meaning having secured support or having sought support. So this particular passage comes from a different text in the Vinaya, the chapter on minor matters of monastic discipline. And both Mitra and Claude, they silently omit the gerundial phrase ne chete, having sought support. And instead, they elide the phrases on either side of that to create a meaning or an interpretation of its own. And so, as you can see, the translation, as I believe it should read, is having sought support, that's the gerundial phrase, from one another, these large group of monks were living at a site. But both Mitra and Claude misconstrue, well, in fact, they omit ne chete and therefore misconstrue the dukpa to correspond to the chikla, yielding we're staying together, omitting having sought support in each case. So again, this is consequential because this demonstrates a series of distinct actions. There is, first of all, the seeking of support, for which there is a very specific rite in the Vinaya to follow. And then there is the cohabitation that follows with that. But with this elision taking place, or this omission taking place, we don't get any sense of that. So summary, to give a sort of summary of this evaluation, just very quickly, I'd say that Claude and Mitra consistently misinterpreted these 5 uses of ne as moral support and frequently omitted or eliding it. So we see how ne, in the sense of moral supports, given as place or places, lodging, shelter, and so on and so forth. So, I also want to say just briefly about grammar. That both Mitra and Claude easily, and this is drawing upon not just the examples that I'm showing you here, but also some testing of Mitra that I did last year at Kurt's request, and then the 20 or 30 passages that I was looking at here. And that what I found in general is that Mitra and Claude easily handle the grammar of narrative passages, but their accuracy falls off with technical passages. Specifically where the grammatical roles are sharply defined. So here, the original's economy of words and the precision of grammar mean that elision amounts to omission, as, for example, we saw with this gerundial phrase, ne chete, or having sought support. So that then brings us to the conclusion of my talk, which is sort of an issue of a different kind, which is that what do we do when, it's fairly obvious if you can look at a machine translation and say, oh, that's wrong. But what happens when we look at a machine translation and it's not obviously wrong, but also not readily justifiable? And this, I think, is an interesting question for us to think through. So here I've just given a Sutra 70 from Gunaprabha's Vinaya Sutra to illustrate. But what's really important, again, is simply the use of the different forms of ne, whether it's in red, the supported, the student, or ne, the support, the teacher. So essentially what this sutra is saying is that the student shouldn't do anything without first speaking to their teacher about it. And when I put this into Mitra, it gave a very interesting answer. It gave your superior for the support. Claude's response was, I would simply characterize as wrong. But Mitra introduced what I think to be a very interesting issue. And so that's what I want to just spend the rest of my time talking about, is that I can think, having looked at the results of Mitra, I can think of justifications for why we might translate ne as superior. It's not clearly wrong, but the justifications that I think are neither lexical or etymological. It's more that I'm searching around for evidence to support the idea that, oh, this is a good translation. So this raises two questions. Firstly, must we justify a translation before using it publicly? Oh, right, because here, Mitra says that ne means your superior. So as a user, at what point do I stop and simply accept that that's wrong? If I say, oh, well, I can't obviously prove it's wrong, do I then assume that it's necessarily right? And is there any obligation as a user for me to try and justify or verify the suggestion that the machine translation has produced? And I think the second question it raises is that because I think presumably we're all going to agree that translation must be justified after using it publicly. Privately, we might use it for whatever purposes, but if we want to use it for scholarly or religious purposes, then we have a responsibility to verify the results of our work. So an editor can't just simply take the semblance of meaning or coherence for granted. You really have to investigate it carefully. And that investigation, of course, requires a lot of skill, knowledge, and experience. So these superficially apt, but in fact incorrect translations may be the most difficult to spot, and consequently would be the most widely proliferated when a work is not carefully edited. Whether that lack of editing is due to a lack of skill and expertise, for example, people using the technology without the proper training, or without the necessary training, to edit it, or if the editing is done poorly simply because of lack of time or haste or rush. I think everyone can identify with this pressure to produce and to finish one project and move on to the next. So I think we can say that meaning is woven together by the reader, whose reading is informed by their knowledge, experiences, and the resources that they bring to bear upon the act of reading. And if called upon to defend a translation, a hypothetical reader could, or at least should be able to, defend their translation by tracking the steps that they've used to reach that conclusion. The question I mean to pose then is this. Is a result from machine translation enough, or must the process of reaching it also be traceable? So to put it another way, how important is justifiability? So in math, one can find new ways to a result, but they must still be proven with equations that other mathematicians can either verify or falsify. Machine translation is introducing a sort of interesting alternative in that it's producing results, but we can't verify those results, or at least it doesn't come along with a justification. So that, I think, puts the responsibility on us as users, is to do the verification ourselves, and that's something that that's maybe a question or an issue that with haste and productivity sort of gets thrown under the bus. So anyway, what I want to just say in closing is that I think it's important that the technology is clearly impressive, and it clearly does things more quickly than certain things more quickly than we as humans do. And there are a lot of benefits, of course, to be gained from adopting the technology. However, I think that it's very important that we adopt the technology very, very carefully. And by recognizing, for example, that the gap that exists between the result of a machine translation and the standard that we would require as academics or Buddhist practitioners for accuracy. In other words, I mean to suggest that at present, there's a gap between the results of machine translation and translations that are truly fit for purpose. And it's very easy for us to underestimate the amount of work that it takes to bring a machine translation result up to a state that it's fit for purpose. I think it's really important that we recognize that the skills to be able to do so require expertise in grammar and lexicon of at least 3 languages, familiarity with subject matter, appreciation for literary genres, devices, styles, reference to relevant commentaries, reference to relevant secondary scholarship, and so on and so forth. So it's very easy to kind of get a result and think, oh, well, that's it. But if you don't really know the material, how do you know that that's it? And how often are you pausing to stop and to really do the work to make sure and verify that that's it? And if we don't do the work to verify that's it, doesn't that mean that simply more mistakes are just getting fed into the system? And that then leads to the proliferation of error that I think is very possible. So, thank you for this opportunity to address you all. And that is, Sebastian, I hope that's the nuanced evaluation of translation that I'm able to give in about 25 minutes. So.
Thank you very much, Bob.
We're fielding questions. Just a brief comment from me. I think your talk and also Megan's talks makes it very clear that engaging with the text is what we have to do, and AI doesn't replace it. It's not only that the only way we actually see what's going on in the text is to see problems is when we engage with them closely. It's obvious. But in defense of AI, you've chosen as an example a very difficult text. As we both know, when we worked on it for your dissertation, the human translations they're not much better than what you've just shown us. So to me, it looks like AI is just a further colleague.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the reason I chose to use this name wasn't because I was trying to trying to trick, but rather based on the assumption, and this is that my understanding is that extreme cases like these can often be the most illustrative in showing some of the technical or conceptual difficulties in a thing. So you're absolutely right. I chose it because it is so polysemous, and the use I was interested in is one of the least common. So I think that a concentration on these type of words has an opportunity to show the difficulties. But absolutely, this, like I said, I've been working on it since 2010. So.
And thanks for a wonderful presentation of an explanation of a very difficult word. I have a question which perhaps sounds tendentious or even weird, but it came up strongly in my mind is, how do you decide that you have some sort of privilege as a human being to be able to critique the thing that the machine's doing? Is there something different going on there that allows you to do that? And I'd like, if you could, to explain that.
That's a very interesting question. So that's what I started that's what I had hoped to investigate with my talk. And as I mentioned, I found myself sort of being reduced to absurdity, with every line of thinking that I pursued. So I then began to think about. I came across Gerard Genet's book Palimpsest, Literature in the Second Degree, where he talks about these different types of transtextuality. And the details here are important, but what it struck me is that this is actually a good sort of model for the different hermeneutic considerations that go into the act of interpretation. And so me as a human translator, I am approaching, a text, first with the Tibetan and then through the dictionary resources, drawing upon my own training, looking at the commentaries, and so on and so forth. So it's certainly possible, especially with some of the issues, the potential developments in AI, that machine translation software models will be able to incorporate more and more of these hermeneutic considerations, and therefore become more and more, sort of aligned or accurate with human processes. I don't think that exists now, but so the question is there something fundamentally different about that? To me, that's an open philosophical question. I don't know. That's my honest intellectual answer, which is not to say I'm not interested in the question. I think it's fascinating, but too much for now.
Kurt, please.
Thank you for your talk and very interesting examples. I'm honestly not trying to throw you a softball for praise or something, but I would like to better understand where machine translation in a very practical way fits into your approach to translating now.
So
translating.
Yeah, so I have not adopted machine translation in my workflow. I'm still old-fashioned in that regard. Part of the reason is because the work that I do is on the Mula-Sarvastivada Vinaya, and one of the greatest challenges in translating the Mula-Sarvastivada Vinaya is actually just simply understanding what the terms mean. So, and this unfortunately is, and I think that's one of the things that this word "ne" illustrates, is that it's oftentimes Vinaya usage is low down on the list of frequency. And so I haven't found machine translation to be very well suited to my area. Nevertheless, I can, I've heard of, nevertheless, I do see applications for AI translations and so forth, but I haven't adopted it for my own practice for that reason.
I may add to Kurt's question, what about your work as editor of 84,000? I mean, as we know, the quality of translation is somehow mixed. Can AI be a useful kind of other voice, parallel, a tool to improve the quality of the translations being produced?
So I think that to address the issues in the pre-existing translations really require skilled human editors to go back and make those corrections. I do, however, think that AI and so forth can be extremely useful as the 84,000 project turns from the Kangyur to the Tengyur, when you have these incredible amounts of intertextuality, and text alignment and so forth could ease the process of a human translator immeasurably. So as far as going back and identifying problems in pre-existing translations, yeah, sure, AI could be used. But that's still begging the question that of justification, because I still think we have to justify or verify the results of machine translation before we can go ahead and use them. So no to the first one, but absolutely huge and very beneficial applications for the project as a whole.
We are almost out of time, but I'd be happy to field another 1 or 2 questions if there's any other comments.
I've got a fairly obvious question, actually. I think it's obvious. But whenever I buy an academic translation of a Buddhist text, there is more text in the footnotes. And talk about justification, there is more text in the footnotes than there is in the actual translated text. So I just can't see any way that AI can do that with text footnotes, with citations and so on in canonical texts. Unless there's, you can, Michael, is that how you see it?
No, it's more that AI would be used to align resources that then appear on the translator's, work in the workflow, that then they're able to workflow. So recognize, for example, that that if you're working on a commentary, so this is very common in Kongyur and Tengyur, well, you have a mula or a root text and a commentary directly upon that. And so you have different types of commentaries, whether they're focused on the word or it's an overview of the whole text, but if you could apply machine translation to align the different commentaries to the areas in the root text, that's the kind of application. And then from that point, the translator still has to do their work. The editor still has to do their work. But I suppose in this view, the human-machine alignment is sort of beginning using the machine to create the basic data that then is assessed by the human, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Bob. Megan.
Hi, Bob. Megan here. I don't know if you can see us or not, but thank you for your talk. And just a footnote to that question about footnotes. In my world, that's called the exegetical apparatus that is produced in the course of translation. This is the commentary that's being produced, and this is our indigenous format in the West of the book with the footnotes. So anyway, thanks, Bob.
Yeah. Oh, I realized I didn't address Gareth's question entirely. To try and put it simply, the process, what gives me the confidence to critique the machine? Hubris, I suppose, experience, I don't know, but also just results. I think that I have found over the course of almost 25 years working as a translator, one of the best ways we can see if a term is a good translation is to just plug it into all sorts of different instances. And when you find that that a single word is coherent, a coherent word, or excuse me, a single word maintains coherence of meaning and applicability to context over time, then I think you've got a good reason to think that. So that's a criteria you can use with some machine translation stuff, but it's really going through that process and finding the errors that have made me think, oh, okay, this is the type of mistakes, polysemous words with, low on the list of frequency. This is the type of thing where machine translation is relatively weak.
Hi, Bob. I have a short question, very short. Do you guys actually use more classical methods such as semantic mapping through word embeddings and stuff like that when you're hitting, a snag with a technical term, just to get a sense of what could be synonyms or collocations or words using in a similar semantical way, right?
Thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent question. And this is, I think, this is an area that Sebastian's work and so many other Michael's work is really relevant, is that a lot of what I do to determine the meaning of terms is triangulating between languages. So I work primarily in Tibetan and Sanskrit, also Pali and in Chinese. And so what I do is my first recourse is really if there is a commentary on the original text, I refer to the commentary. And then if there are parallels in other languages, I refer to those parallels. And so it's through kind of getting together this whole map of the usage as it is in Sanskrit, Pali, Chinese, Tibetan, that I can begin to, I think, begin to triangulate what the concept that's joining all of these things is. And that is maybe a skill that machine translation can do very well by so long as it has the input of these different languages. But that's essentially what it is a process of triangulation based on usage in different languages, and recourse to traditional commentaries and so on and so forth. To be honest, in my area of the Vinaya, lexical resources are not usually very helpful. The major exceptions being Edgerton, Negi, and Apte.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Our final speaker for today is Professor Kiyonori Nagasaki from the International Institute for Digital Humanities, and he's speaking on enhancing Buddhist scripture research with imperfect AI outcomes, a case study of SAT text database.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. So I'm very honored to be invited to such a wonderful academic meeting. So before starting my talk, I think it's better to introduce my background briefly. So let me introduce myself a little. So in the last decade of the last century, I was studying Buddhism, especially Madhyamaka school. So during my undergraduate and graduate years, so I was reading Prasanapada and other commentaries of Madhyamaka Karika and some Pramana Shastra with Dr. Motoi Ono. Then, so at the same time, however, I was also studying computer, especially web technology, which was just beginning at the time, and was hired by the university as a tenured faculty member in computer science. So after that, I resigned from the university to concentrate on the SAT project, which I will explain later. So, and established the International Institute for Digital Humanities. So then I worked there for over 10 years and will do some more decade. Additionally, from this April, I become a professor of library information science with the expectation of establishment of a DH course here at the Keio University. So there are indeed many interesting topics between Buddhism and AI, which I have enjoyed today. But since I've been working on using computers for Buddhist studies as my digital humanities research for a long time, I will also talk about AI from such a practical and pragmatic perspective. So then I'd like to present this title, Enhancing Buddhist Studies with Imperfect AI Outcomes. 2 case studies in the SAT text database project. Then today's 2 themes is here. So AI OCR and its application. So this is a solution developed and in operation for 2 years. And it's enhancing critical editing of Buddhist scriptures with AI. And the second, a case study of RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation with Gemini by Google for Buddhist studies. solution recently started, but not yet ready for public service due to cost issues. So it's preparing for supportive tools for bridge studies with AI. So I'd like to introduce briefly the SAT, SAT Daizokyo Text Database Project or Committee. So the SAT is an acronym of Sanskrit word Sanganiki Kritam Taisho Tripitaka. So it means that's a kind of a Taisho edition. So it's a digitized version of the 100 volumes of a famous comprehensive edition of a series of Buddhist studies, Taisho edition. So it consists of over 100 million Chinese, Japanese, and Indic characters, and the project was established in 1994. The project has been led by Emeritus Professor Masahiro Shimoda in the University of Tokyo. And it aims to form a digital environment for Buddhist studies. So recently focused on reviewing and revising some international standards for Buddhist studies and East Asian studies. Then I have been working in the project as the technical manager and the programmer since 2005. Then this is some versions of the current SAT databases. Then, so 2008, the first edition, and the second edition was first published in 2012, and revised version was released in 2015, and then the new version published in 2018, and then 2020 version are not yet published, but so now, due to some reasons, especially the life cycle of a JavaScript framework, so it's now revising. Then so activities of SAT project for the standards. So to help you understand this presentation, I will explain the standardization effort of this project. So SAT focuses on the following 3 standards for its purpose to form the basis of Buddhist studies in the digital environment. So Unicode, TEI, a text encoding initiative guidelines, and IIIF, International Image Interpretability Framework. So non-Latin characters for Unicode to enable Buddhist studies to be conducted without hindrance in our typical computer environment. So like medieval Unicode font initiative for European medieval manuscript. So but the number of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean ideographies is much larger. Then so the project already succeeded to propose the ISO committee, ISO IC JTC1 SC2 to add over 3,000 characters of CJK unified ideographs occurring in the Taisho edition. The achievements are utilized not only by our project, SAT project, but also by CBETA in Taiwan and other projects using classical Chinese characters. The proposal of the 6 variant characters into the code chart of Shita characters, which were born in India and have been used since medieval Japan, were also successful. The SAT is still working on confirming and registering the rest of the characters in the Taisho edition and other Buddhist canons. So this is the code chart, and then so the marked characters were proposed by SAT project. Right. So this is a part of the Unicode code chart. Then I'd like to introduce IIIF standard. So it was started in 2011 by some powerful research libraries in Europe and the United States, and it's spread in 2015 to 2017 among the libraries in the world, including Japan. It enables to add annotations on any digital images and include or so integrate digital images on web, including those published on extra website. So you can see all of it on the website, official website. This is the official website of TripleF, and then so our project also contributed so a kind of product like this. So this is a mandala. So, and then our project provides almost three product for TripleF like this since 2016. Then we provide many digitized images of Buddhist canons with TripleF. Then, so for example, this is our first product using TripleF. So SAT Taishozo image database. So it's now so include over 20,000 annotations so embedded on Buddhist icons. So Amanda has over 400 annotations to each bodhisattva and icon. Then see here like this. So this is a typical example of mandala including annotations. Then so user can search an annotated part of an image by keyword on this server. Then so also searched by the prepared vocabulary for Buddhist icons. Then so this is an example of search result of flaming hair. So then user can see various types of Buddhist icons with flaming hair like this, and then so user can compare arbitrary images in the search result like this, and user can zoom in each flaming hair like this. So TripleF also so useful for text database. So SAT implemented a web catalog of the TripleF compliant Buddhist text images in the world with a web API in 2017. So now being collaboratively edited. So it enabled the linking of images of the witnesses with textual data in the unit of fascicles. So like this. So this is a larger image like this. So in this case, so the images can be compared on one website like this. Then so we implemented a manual function to link between text and the fragment of an image like this. So this is a variant reading with the images. Then, so it's also a variant characters. So can be linked like this. So then recent massive digitization of these canons is so incredible. So each edition has 50. So from 150,000 to 190,000 images. Then two Song edition from Imperial Palace and Zojoji Temple, and Korean edition of Tripitaka Koreana from Zojoji Temple, and so Yuan edition from Zojoji Temple, and Ming edition from the University of Tokyo Library. So, and some other rare materials, such as Dunfa manuscript in IDP project, so International Dunfa project, are also already provided for us on the web, and preparing at least 3 more editions in Japan, Korea, and China. So, Tripitaka and a large number of the witnesses must be correlated with text data. So, and then we implemented a digital scholarly browsing editing system for Buddhist canons. So, that project has released the new function for digital scholarly browsing and editing with 5 editions of Buddhist canon and other manuscripts. So the laboratory in the National Data Library in Japan recently released, so around 2 years ago, and now improving that. And so a deep learning OCR for Japanese classical books, including Chinese ones. So as you know, Japanese classics include Chinese classical text. So then, this software provides significantly more accurate text than ever before, even with respect to woodcut printing, and it is open source software available to anyone. So I've been collaborating with the library as a visiting researcher of the laboratory since a decade ago. Then the software uses Cascade Mask RCNN for layered detection and TR-OCR for text detection with Roberta Small as decoder. Then, so SAT has released the system using the OCR software. So it will be so much easier than in the past because we don't have to compare every single letter, but only check the different parts. So now, just now, unfortunately, so due to legal power outage, so this server is not available. But so usually you can access to this system. So this system provides image of a witness, and then provide deep learning OCR text of the digital image. Then and this text are automatically compared with the Taishan text provided by the SAT database, so Taishan edition. This text is already proofread by human eyes. This comparison detects different characters. The different characters, so at least have 2 types. One is the miss OCR, mistake of OCR, and then another type is just a kind of variant reading or variant character. Then like this, the number is very few rather than checking all characters. Then user can see it on the SAT website easily. So for example, by clicking the Tripitaka Koreana and then click a part of the image, so user can see if the power is available. So then it's also, and the function also provides a simple editing system. Then user can correct the misauthored text. The user can go into the editing mode by Google account. So, okay. Then, so this is our one solution. Then another. So I'd like to present about another our solution with AI. So already some presenters explained the RAG. So RAG, retrieval augmented generation, is a little bit convenient. So RAG is a technique that combines generative AI with information retrieval. So the model utilized external data sources to generate more accurate and up-to-date responses to user queries. Then, so the user input a question, then model searches external databases or documents for relevant information. Then, based on the retrieved data, the model generates an appropriate response. Is ideal activities. Then, so advantages of RAG is increased reliability, enhanced knowledge, and wide applicability. So this is a typical data flow in RAG. So when a user make a kind of question and input a question, then query input it, then the query enter into the search. So search relevant information. That's it means that the kind of just a search engine or something like that, but so a little bit specialized search engine. So the data source, data provider or RAG provider prepares kind of knowledge sources, which it's want to make users search, and then so the search relevant information are generated by a kind of search engine. It's so-called usually vector store. Then relevant information for enhanced or enhanced context, or so return back to the data flow. Then it's sent to the a kind of generative AI like ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini, or something like that. Then so user can see the generated answer, so derived from the prepared information. So past issues in RAG, so the number of characters or tokens in the prompt that could be read was small. The search results from the knowledge base or database had to be narrowed down considerably, so making it difficult to gather the necessary information. However, recently, Google released the Gemini 1.5 Pro API. It allows us to use 1 million tokens, so we can send 1 million tokens to generative AI API. So then it means that we can send over 20 academic papers so to the prompt with API. So then it can generate an answer based on over 20 academic papers. Then this is our case study. So building an AI to support Buddhist studies with RAG. So our database includes over 40,000 papers of Journal of the Japanese Association for Indian and Buddhist Studies, you may know Inbutsuken. So it was published from 1952. Then, so I scraped all papers and metadata from the website which the journal published. So then transcribe the text by OCR software developed by the National Diet Library in Japan. So it has so good function to read all the meta-printing or something like that. Then, so relatively accurate text can be generated, and we have such a number of texts or papers. Then, so I tested retrieval functions, 3 retrieval functions. So for measuring document similarity, so 20 academic, so get together 20 academic papers. So once, so I tested ChromaDB. It is an open source vector store used for storing and retrieving vector embeddings. It's maybe most famous software for RAG. And then I tested also Apache Sora. Sora is not good at searching by natural text. And then, so query is tokenized by Spatie and extended by Soras for Buddhist studies. Then, so I used 2 methods for measuring document similarity provided by Apache Sora, BM25 and TF-IDF. Then, so by 3 functions, so I selected 20 papers and sent them with prompt to Gemini. Then, so it's also not available for power outrage. So then I already get the result of the lab. So all of the information is in Japanese, but so this question is there a possibility for nirvana for Ichantika. So then, this answer provides some papers or evidence like this. Then this generative AI summarize based on the 20 academic papers. Then here the summarize. This is not so wrong. So yeah. And then some other questions. So please tell us about the state of preservation of sacred materials in Japanese temples and shrines. So it also provides a good answer using the academic papers so published in the Inbutsuken. So then, of course, you can read by translation of generative AI, or DeepL. So as you may know, DeepL is very good for translating between Japanese and English. Then, so this answer also includes various academic papers, and it provides a link to the papers itself, like this. Then user can check each evidence on the academic paper, like this. So one more question. So Professor Shimoda, the leader of our project, tried to ask a question. Do you think it is possible to restore the reality of primitive Buddhism from existing sources? So this question is, then Professor Shimoda told me that this answer is good. He's a researcher of early Buddhism. Then this answer also includes various academic articles like this, click like this. Then user can treat these answers by checking the evidence. Okay, then current my impression of the lag, the answers are based on 20 academic papers, so they are relatively accurate, and furthermore, the sources are always given, so they are easy to check. For academic questions, Apache Soras was such, but expanding the Soras tends to be more accurate than ChromaDB vector store software, because users are asking in technical terms. So vector store sometimes ignores such technical terms or something like that. So as a result, I found it useful for researching things that are not one's direct area of expertise. But it costs between a little bit money per query, so it cannot be opened to the public unless it becomes cheaper. So if this becomes publicly available, it's feared that grading student reports will become even more difficult. And then further development, increasing the number of target articles. Now that I have completed the workflow to make PDF of articles searchable in RAG as text, then I will treat other journals. Then testing over vector stores. I have only tried one vector store, ChromaDB, and would like to try other software if possible. And then solutions to increase users without increasing costs. So generative AI's rates may go down in the near future, I hope. So, okay, that's all. Thank you.
I like your RAG a lot. This was not ragged at all. This is the best application I've seen in Buddhist studies now for this. And but I wanted to ask about an earlier portion of your presentation where you said that users can edit the OCR. Yeah. And how do you prevent vandalism in that? You say I can log in with my Google account, yes, but I can have an anonymous Google account. How do you prevent vandalism, that people go in and do nonsense stuff?
Yeah. So all activities are recorded on the server then. So we can kick out any activities if something wrong. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. So why don't you include primary sources in doing the RAG?
In RAG?
Yeah.
So primary sources is different languages. So if Japanese Buddhist text, so in the case of Japanese Buddhist text, primary sources is different languages, which can be which is difficult to be analyzed.
So you could either pre-translate, or you could try to develop some sort of multilingual embedding.
Yeah. So if the pre-translation is available, it can be included. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nagasaki Sensei. I have two questions. First of all, this slide here, when you see, could you explain what you mean by deep learning OCR in this text of the digital image on the right? I think it wasn't so clear to us what the relationship is to the three texts. So the left side is the Taisho set text? Correct?
Yes, Taisho text.
Okay, and then the right side is the Hanpon, the wood block?
Yes.
Okay, and so then the center is a kind of artificial combination, is that what that is, of those two?
This text is just OCR text from this image. And then the yellow marked characters are different characters from the Taisho text.
So when you say deep learning, what you mean is that this, it recognizes that the characters are different. Is that your understanding?
No, but so deep learning, deep learning function is used in just OCR. From generating this text from this image. So yeah. So these are
OCR, but it's algorithms used. Yeah.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. And I have a question about additions we use for comparison. So do you plan to expand to include like more additions? Like now you have like 4 to 5 additions. Could you expand it in the future?
Yes, of course. Yeah, we are preparing for expand. Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any last questions, comments? If not, thank you very much for the talk and the wonderful work. And I want to thank all of the conference participants. I want to thank our sponsors, particularly the Sadra folks who are here, and Sanjo Mandalay, who worked so hard to put all this together.